Welcome, dear listener, to this journey through the mist-shrouded streets of Victorian London. As you settle in for a bit of history to unwind your day, I invite you to pause for a moment and leave a comment sharing where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you right now. It's always comforting to know how far our community of nocturnal historians reaches, and if you enjoy these quiet, story-rich rambles through times gone by, be sure to subscribe so you can drift off to the past each night. But for now, let us turn back the clock to the 19th century, to an era of grand palaces and sooty slums, a time of empire and industry, of brilliant achievements and human misery. The Victorian age was a study in contrasts, especially in the teeming capital of London, for beneath the stately edifices and glittering balls of the upper crust lay a vast underworld of gut-wrenching poverty, where merely surviving the day was a Herculean feat. Imagine, if you will, the grim and gritty streets of London's East End, where rickety tenements teeter above dank alleys and the air hangs heavy with the stench of sewage and despair. Here, the working poor are crammed into crumbling hovels, entire families squeezed into a single fetid room with little light or air. The slums of Whitechapel and Spitalfields are notorious rookeries where rubbish and waste fester underfoot. Sanitation is an unknown luxury, with no proper sewers or running water, human waste and rotting garbage moulder in reeking cesspools and overflowing gutters. It's in these wretched streets that we meet young Jack, a spindly 12-year-old lad with quick fingers and sharp eyes. By day, Jack is a mudlark, one of the many children who scavenge in the thick muck along the River Thames at low tide, searching for lumps of coal, bits of rope, or if he's lucky, a shiny halfpenny dropped by a passing toff. The muck sucks at his bare feet, the shards of glass and pottery slicing his soles. But Jack doesn't mind. It's a good day when he finds enough coal to keep his family's hearth fire burning for a few hours. But Jack is also a tosher, a sewer hunter who wades through the foul underground channels in the hopes of finding something valuable washed down from the streets above. He holds his breath against the vile stench, squinting in the dim light filtering through the grates, always listening for the telltale rush that means the tide is turning. To be caught in the sewers when the water rises means almost certain death. But it's a risk Jack is willing to take for a chance at a few coins to fill his family's growling bellies. Jack is one of the lucky ones, if you can call it that. At least he has a family and a place to lay his head at night, even if it's just a filthy corner of a crowded room. For those with nowhere else to turn, the workhouses beckon with their promise of a meal and a bed. But they are hardly a haven. Within their grim walls, the destitute trade their freedom for a crust of bread and a place on a thin pallet. The workhouses are more like prisons than charities, with their strict rules and regimented labour. Families are separated, meagre belongings confiscated, and dignity stripped away. The able-bodied break stones or pick oakum, while the elderly and infirm languish in dank wards. Dinner is a tasteless gruel, ladled into crude bowls, and yet, for many, it is still better than starving on the streets. One who knew the workhouses all too well was Annie Chapman, a young woman who would later meet a grisly end at the hands of Jack the Ripper. As a girl, Annie had stayed in the workhouses when her family fell on hard times. She would later resort to prostitution to survive, walking the dingy streets of Whitechapel, her thin shawl scant protection against the biting cold and the leering glances of the men who prowled the alleyways. For those who managed to avoid the workhouses, perhaps a job could be found along the bustling docks of the Thames. The Port of London was a hive of activity, with ships from every corner of the globe unloading their exotic wares. Brawny dockers hefted crates and barrels, their backs straining under the heavy loads. Accidents were common, with little regard for the safety of the workers. A broken bone or a crushed limb could could spell destitution for a man and his family. Other men sweated long hours in the factories and sweatshops that belched smoke into the sooty sky. In crowded rooms lit by flickering gaslights, they tended rattling machines and boiling vats. Women and children toiled alongside them, their nimble fingers darting as they stitched garments or assembled small parts. The hours were long, the pay measly, and the dangers many. In 1888, a young activist named Annie Besant drew back the curtain on the horrors of the Bryant and May match factory. The matchstick girls, some as young as 12, worked 14-hour days in rooms choked with white phosphorus fumes. Many developed the grotesque deformity known as phossy jaw, their faces eaten away by the toxic chemical. Besant's exposé on this white slavery shocked the public and helped spur the famous London matchgirls' strike of 1888. For the poor souls of the East End, the drudgery of their daily lives was punctuated by the occasional escape into oblivion. Opium, flooding in from British India, was cheap and plentiful. In the dark, hazy dens that dotted the slums, hollow-eyed men and women sprawled on stained mattresses, lost in a narcotic haze. For a few precious hours, they could forget the gnawing hunger and the ache of weary bones. Gin was the other great leveller, offering a brief respite at the bottom of a bottle. The garish gin palaces, with their tawdry gaslights and sawdust-strewn floors, beckoned with the promise of cheap liquor and raucous company. But the merriment often descended into brawls and despairing sobs. Drunkenness stalked the streets, drowning sorrows and fueling violence and vice. The streets themselves were often shrouded in a dense, noxious fog born from thousands of coal fires, belching sooty smoke into the damp air. The pea supers, as they were known, could linger for days, turning midday into midnight. In the swirling gloom, the gaslights cast eerie shadows, making the twisted alleys even more menacing. It was in these fog-choked streets that a very real terror gripped the city in the autumn of 1888. A sinister figure was on the prowl in Whitechapel, brutally slaying women and vanishing into the night. The newspapers dubbed him Jack the Ripper, and his grisly crimes ignited a frenzy of fear and morbid fascination. One by one, the bodies of 5 women, all impoverished prostitutes, were discovered horribly mutilated. The police seemed powerless to stop the carnage, their investigations stymied by the dark, twisting streets and the suffocating fog. Wild theories flew as to the identity of the fiend. Was he a doctor, a butcher, a foreign sailor, or even a member of the royal family? Despite the best efforts of the police, Jack the Ripper was never unmasked. His dark legend lives on as a symbol of the dangers and degradations that stalked the women of the Victorian East End. For those who lived and died in those mean streets, there was little justice and less mercy. Indeed, death was a constant spectre in Victorian London, especially for the poor. Disease ran rampant in the filthy, overcrowded slums. Cholera, spread by tainted water, could fell a strong man in a matter of hours. Typhoid, tuberculosis, and smallpox claimed countless lives. For the upper classes, mourning was an art form, with elaborate rituals and strict codes of etiquette. Queen Victoria herself famously wore black for 40 years after the death of her beloved Prince Albert. But for the poor, even a proper burial was often out of reach. The desperate resorted to the services of the resurrection men, the grave robbers who snatched fresh corpses to sell to eager anatomists for dissection. The idea of one's loved ones being carved up on a surgeon's slab only added to the misery and dread. Strangely, this grim world of the poor held a certain fascination for the well-to-do. Slumming became a fashionable pastime, with genteel ladies and gawking tourists trekking through the East End hovels, eager for a glimpse of how the other half lived. They gawked at the ragged children and recoiled from the stinking alleys, perhaps tossing a few coins to salve their consciences. Some, like the journalist Henry Mayhew and a young Charles Dickens, sought to chronicle the lives of the poor, to give voice to their struggles and their sorrows. Their writings helped to spur a growing movement for social reform, a recognition that something had to be done to alleviate the sufferings of the underclass. But change was slow to come to the fetid streets and alleys. It took the Great Stink of 1858, when the stench of raw sewage in the Thames became so overpowering that Parliament was forced to act, to spur the construction of a proper sewer system. Even then, the grand brick tunnels that still serve London today were built more to protect the delicate noses of the elite than to safeguard the health of the poor. Gradually, glimmers of progress began to penetrate the gloom. Social reformers, like Dr. Thomas Barnardo, opened shelters for orphans and street children. The Salvation Army ministered to the destitute with its promise of soup, soap, and salvation. New model tenements offered a glimpse of a better life, with running water and private balconies. But for most of the Victorian poor, the grinding hardship and heartache remained the backdrop of their brief, blighted lives. They toiled and scraped and suffered, eking out a tenuous existence in the shadows of the glittering wealth and glory of the British Empire. Their struggles may be largely lost to history, but they are threads in the vast, complex tapestry of the human story. As we look back at Victorian London, at its fog-shrouded streets and its gas-lit horrors, we see a city of towering contrasts, of magnificent achievements and gut-wrenching misery, of glittering opulence and abject despair. It was an age of progress and of exploitation, of soaring hopes and dashed dreams. The poor may have been swept to the margins, but their lives mattered, their stories deserved to be told. So let us remember them, these forgotten souls, who lived and died in the shadows of history. Let us marvel at their resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship, and let us mourn for the lives cut short by poverty, disease, and despair. Above all, let us learn from their struggles, and let their suffering spur us to build a world of greater justice, compassion, and opportunity for all. And with that, dear listener, we come to the end of our journey through the dark streets of Victorian London. I hope that this small window into the past has given you a deeper appreciation for the struggles and triumphs of those who came before us. May their stories linger with you as you drift off to sleep, and may you awaken with a renewed sense of empathy and compassion for all those who still suffer in the shadows of our bright, shining world. Until next time, this is your humble guide to the bygone days, bidding you a fond good night. May your dreams be sweeter than the harsh realities of the past, and may you find solace in the knowledge that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit endures. Good night. The pain and misery of London's poor began to stir the conscience of wider society in the Victorian era. Social reformers and philanthropists took up the cause, advocating for change and working to provide some measure of relief to the suffering masses. One such crusader was Charles Dickens, the beloved novelist whose vivid depictions of poverty and injustice helped awaken the public to the plight of the underclass. Born in 1812, Dickens knew firsthand the sting of hardship. As a boy, his father was sent to debtor's prison, forcing young Charles to leave school and work in a factory pasting labels on bottles of bootblacking. The experience left a deep impression on the sensitive and observant child. As Dickens rose to fame as a writer, he used his platform to shed light on the dark underbelly of Victorian society. His novels are populated with unforgettable characters drawn from the ranks of the poor and downtrodden, from the orphan Oliver Twist, who famously asked for more gruel in the workhouse, to Little Nell, a young girl who wanders the industrial wasteland, to Joe the crossing sweeper from Bleak House, who knows nothing of the world beyond his meagre street existence. Dickens wove cutting social commentary into his colourful tales of London life. He railed against the greed and indifference of the wealthy, and the cruel inhumanity of institutions like the workhouses and debtors' prisons. His immense popularity meant his message reached all strata of society. It's said that his works did more to raise awareness of poverty than the crusading speeches of any politician. Dickens was also instrumental in founding Urania Cottage, a home for young women who had turned to theft or prostitution. Rather than treat them as irredeemable outcasts, the home provided rehabilitation through education, training, and the opportunity for a fresh start. A radically progressive approach for the time. Residents were taught domestic skills like cooking and sewing, with the aim of securing respectable employment, often in the colonies. The great author's actions revealed his belief that, with support and means, even those consigned to society's margins could rise above squalid circumstances. In his own life, he quietly assisted individuals in need, answering a flood of letters appealing for help. Dickens' deep moral conscience and empathy for the poor made him one of the Victorian age's most passionate advocates for their cause. Dickens' life and legacy exemplify how the winds of social change began to stir, however tentatively, amidst the grim poverty of Victorian London. Reformist attitudes slowly gained ground thanks to activists, politicians, and authors who forced the public to confront the injustices and indignities the poor faced daily. It would be a long, slow road to meaningful progress for society's wretched refuse. But the first halting steps were being taken. Another flicker of light in the gloom came from Baroness Angela Burdett Coutts, one of the wealthiest women of the Victorian age and a pioneer of philanthropy. Born in 1814 to a prominent banking family, she inherited a vast fortune at the age of 23, instantly becoming one of the richest individuals in England. But rather than indulge in a life of luxury, Angela developed a passion for charitable works. Burdett Coutts focused her efforts on assisting the poor in London's East End, one of the city's most notoriously blighted areas. She financed the construction of model tenements to replace squalid slums, providing clean, affordable housing for hundreds of families. She established a sewing school to teach young women marketable skills and founded a home for fallen women, those who had resorted to prostitution out of desperation. Her approach was innovative in treating the poor with a measure of dignity and respect, in contrast to the harsh judgment and condescension they usually faced from their betters. Burdett Coutts was also groundbreaking in her determination to tackle the roots of poverty, not just provide temporary relief. She funded projects to improve sanitation and access to clean water, rightly seeing that disease and poor hygiene were major factors keeping people trapped in poverty. The Baroness was a fierce advocate for the rights and welfare of children, appalled by the grim fates of London's impoverished youth. She campaigned against the practice of using young boys as chimney sweeps, one of the era's most brutal and dangerous forms of child labour. Small children were sent scrambling up narrow, maze-like chimneys, choked with coal soot and carcinogenic creosote. Many suffered respiratory ailments, deformities from contorting their growing bodies, and sometimes suffocated when they became stuck. Burdett Coutts used her influence to lobby for protective legislation, resulting in the Chimney Sweepers and Chimneys Regulation Act of 1840, which prohibited the use of children under 16 for this work. She was also a key supporter of the Ragged School movement, which established hundreds of free schools to educate poor children and keep them off the streets. Well into her 80s, Burdett Coutts continued to pour her time and fortune into bettering the lives of London's forgotten poor. Contemporaries described her as having an almost saintly aura, her face lined with sympathy and wisdom. Queen Victoria herself was so taken with the Baroness's good works, she proposed elevating her to the peerage, making her the first woman to be made a peer in her own right. The Baroness's shining example helped inspire a new ethic of philanthropy among Britain's upper crust. It became fashionable to support charitable causes, and more of London's elite began funneling portions of their wealth to help the needy. High society magazines breathlessly reported on glittering charity balls and the donation goals reached. Of course, some of this was more about keeping up appearances and social one-upmanship than heartfelt benevolence. But it nonetheless meant an influx of funds to fuel the efforts of reformers. Naturally, this top-down charity was a far cry from truly shifting the balance of power and means in Victorian society. The poor were still viewed more as pitiable objects of mercy than fully equal human beings. Much of the money went to short-term handouts rather than deeper structural changes. A great many among the wealthy still clung to the old Victorian shibboleth that poverty stemmed from moral failing and weak character. But it was a start. The suffering of the poor could no longer be swept completely out of sight and mind. The ranks of the wretched were no longer completely forsaken, and within the brutal machinery of London's workhouses and factories, we begin to see individual lives take on greater dimension through the extraordinary efforts of these few determined souls. Every school founded, every disease averted, every exploited child rescued. Each was a tiny victory for hope in the face of the era's crushing hardships. As the 19th century wound to a close, the lot of London's labouring poor saw some slow but notable improvements. Grassroots labour movements, having begun to find their footing and rally working people to their cause, won a series of key reforms through dogged activism and pressure. The Reform Act of 1867 extended the vote to more working-class men, giving them a voice in the halls of power for the first time. The Elementary Education Act of 1870 established a system of government-funded schools, opening the door to education for countless poor children. The Trade Union Act of 1871 legalised unions and protected the right to strike, a major milestone in levelling the field between workers and their employers. And the Factory Act of 1878 set limits on the workday, a move towards more humane labour conditions. Life was still unrelentingly harsh for most poor Londoners as the Victorian era ended, but the seeds of positive change had been planted. The misery and squalor that had once been ignored now stirred a social conscience and sense of responsibility. Attitudes were shifting, albeit gradually, to a belief that even the lowliest souls deserved a modicum of dignity and opportunity. Victorian London will always be remembered for its appalling poverty, but it was also the beginning of a steady march towards justice and equality. In the stories of figures like Charles Dickens and Baroness Burdett Coutts, we catch glimmers of what could be achieved when conscience and conviction spurred people to action. Their deeds foreshadow social activism movements that would gather momentum in the 20th century and beyond. So the next time you stroll past the splendid architecture of central London, the regal halls of Westminster, the grand dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, the palatial facades of the West End manors, take a moment to reflect on the human cost and suffering woven into their history, but also remember the precious strands of hope and decency stubbornly taking root in those brutal times. And spare a thought for young Jack the Mudlark, scavenging the foul banks of the Thames to scrape by, his bare feet cut and muddied. Imagine the Baroness approaching him, bending down to press a coin into his grubby hand with a kind word. Jack tentatively smiles back, uncomprehending this gesture of pure generosity, so rare in his wretched world. It's a small moment, a tiny ripple of goodness in an ocean of struggle. But it matters. In the individual acts of compassion and selflessness glinting through the dark despair of the Victorian poor, we find hope for something better. The promise that with enough empathy and determination, we can build a society with dignity for all. The Victorian cult of death cast a long, dark shadow over London society. In an era when disease ran rampant and life expectancy hovered around a mere 40 years, death was an ever-present spectre looming over rich and poor alike. But while the wealthy could afford elaborate funerals and strict mourning rituals, The poor often suffered unceremonious and undignified ends, their bodies sometimes even snatched by grave robbers for anatomists' grim studies. Queen Victoria herself was the most prominent face of this morbid obsession. After the untimely death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, in 1861, the Queen retreated into a state of deep mourning that would last for the remaining 4 decades of her reign. She donned black crepe dresses, avoided public appearances, and even had her servants lay out Albert's clothes each morning as if he were still alive. This set the tone for her subjects to mimic, as mourning etiquette reached almost absurd heights among the upper classes. Widows were expected to wear full black mourning attire for at least 2 years after their husbands' deaths, with strict rules dictating everything from the width of veils to the dullness of jewelry. Advertisers eagerly promoted merchandise to match the somber mood, hawking black-bordered stationery, funeral biscuits, and specially made mourning clothing that could be rented by those who couldn't afford their own. Even calling cards and letters of condolence followed rigid guidelines. The prosperous sought to honor and memorialize their dead with increasingly lavish funerals and grave markers. Entire businesses sprang up to cater to the costly affairs, renting out professional mourners to pad the crowd of grievers and selling memento mori, small tokens and trinkets incorporating the hair or ashes of the deceased. Post-mortem photography also emerged as a popular way to preserve the likeness of dead loved ones, with carefully staged portraits of propped-up corpses, often the only photographs families would have to remember them by. But for London's legions of poor, death was a far bleaker affair devoid of pomp and ceremony. Many families could barely afford the basic pine coffins, let alone the lofty trappings of Victorian mourning customs. Paupers' funerals were a bare-bones business, with multiple bodies sometimes crammed into a single grave in the city's overcrowded cemeteries. The indigent and unknown were buried in unmarked plots, their lives and deaths unrecorded and unmourned by the society that had failed them in life. Even more disheartening was the practice of body snatching by so-called resurrection men. Due to laws restricting the dissection of corpses to executed criminals, the growing ranks of anatomists and medical students faced a severe shortage of subjects to study. A lucrative black market trade arose, with grave robbers plundering the coffins of the recently buried to sell the bodies to doctors for a handsome price. The poor, often interred without a secure coffin or watchman, were disproportionately targeted by these ghoulish thieves. The grim realities faced by London's underclass in death reflected the deprivations and oppression they endured in life. While the bereaved bourgeoisie paraded their mourning like a badge of dignified gentility, the poor scraped by with paupers' burials, the indignity of the resurrectionists, and little means to memorialize their losses. The cult of death, like so much in Victorian society, only highlighted the stark divides between the privileged and the powerless. But even as the Victorians venerated death with one face, a strange fascination with the spectacle of poverty arose among the well-to-do with another. The grim lives of London's poor became a voyeuristic curiosity for the wealthy, who engaged in a particularly condescending kind of tourism known as slumming. Guided by police escorts or enterprising locals, upper-class Londoners would venture into notorious slum areas like Whitechapel or the Rookeries of St Giles to observe how the other half lived. They gawked at residents eking out a living in cramped, crumbling tenements and sidestepped the sewage and filth clogging the streets. Some even played at dressing down to blend in, swapping silks and top hats for rough woolens and caps. Of course, these brief jaunts into the nether regions of London life offered only a sanitized glimpse of poverty, colored by the comfortable distance of privilege. The wealthy could satisfy their lurid curiosity with an afternoon stroll through the slums before retreating back to their cozy carriages and elegant squares, leaving the poor to their plight. For the underclass, the deprivation and desperation the slummers viewed as a passing spectacle were an inescapable reality. That's not to say these poverty tourists were solely motivated by morbid titillation. Some, like social researcher Henry Mayhew and novelist Charles Dickens, aimed to document the conditions of the poor to spur action and reform. Mayhew's book, London Labour and the London Poor, offered a groundbreaking and sympathetic study of street hawkers, beggars, and scavengers. Dickens drew on his own impoverished childhood to seed his novels with vivid, often sentimentalized portraits of workhouses and orphans. Writers and reformers like Mayhew and Dickens did help raise awareness of the plight of the poor. But progress was painstaking, and many Victorians remained apathetic or even hostile to aiding those they saw as lazy, immoral, and undeserving. The squalid spectacle of slum life inspired more gawking than meaningful change for many years. Gradually, however, the sheer severity of the suffering began to stir the conscience of Victorian society. The combined efforts of crusading journalists, philanthropists, and newly formed charitable organisations cast a harsher light on the failures of Britain's vaunted empire to provide for its most vulnerable subjects. Small seeds of reform took root, though frustratingly slowly for those mired in misery. Religious missions like the Salvation Army, established in 1865, offered aid and ministered to the poor under the banner of Christianity, with its sleeves rolled up. They provided food, coal, shelter, and limited education to the needy, alongside a dose of evangelical preaching. Social activists like Dr. Thomas Barnardo and Lord Shaftesbury agitated for child welfare reforms, taking in street urchins and campaigning against the evils of child labour. The horrific housing of London's poor also drew the attention of social campaigners. American journalist Jacob Riis chronicled the squalid conditions in his muckraking classic How the Other Half Lives, which spurred slum clearance efforts and the construction of model dwellings, like the Peabody Estates. While these tenements offered marginal improvements over the old rookeries, they still fell woefully short of providing truly humane housing. Other gradual gains, like the Education Act of 1870 that allocated government funds for new schools and the formation of settlement houses to aid poor families, marked tentative but important steps towards easing the burden of poverty. But the pace of progress failed to match the urgency of need, and hundreds of thousands of Londoners continued to subsist in wretched conditions for decades to come. It would ultimately take a public health catastrophe to spur one of the most transformative social reforms of the Victorian era. For years, London's primitive sanitation system had struggled to contain the massive amount of waste produced by the booming city. Human excrement and industrial runoff drained into rickety cesspools and crude sewers that emptied directly into the Thames, contaminating wells and spreading waterborne diseases like cholera. The hot summer of 1858 brought this festering problem to a head in the form of the Great Stink. Unusually high temperatures coupled with a lack of rainfall left the river a stagnant, reeking soup of human and animal waste. The stench was so overpowering that sheets soaked in lime chloride were draped over the windows of Parliament in a futile attempt to keep the odious vapours at bay, with many politicians taking to carrying nosegays to suppress their gags. Fears that the fetid miasma would spark another deadly cholera epidemic finally pushed legislators to act. They granted funding to the Metropolitan Board of Works to construct a groundbreaking network of brick-lined interceptor sewers and pumping stations, designed by Chief Engineer Joseph Bazalgette, to carry waste far downstream from the city centre. The Southern Outfall sewer alone stretched a staggering 7 miles long. Along the way, the Thames embankment was built to further beautify and sanitise the river. Completed in 1865, Bazalgette's pioneering sewer system was a massive feat of civil engineering that vastly improved public health and hygiene for Londoners of all classes. Cholera cases plummeted and the noxious odours abated. The Thames began to recover from centuries of abuse. The benefits of this investment are still enjoyed by the city today, a rare bright spot of unequivocal progress amid the murky miseries of Victorian London. For despite the halting reforms and works of mercy, the poor still faced a harsh and heartbreaking reality as the 19th century wound to a close. Children laboured in dangerous factories and scavenged for scraps in scrapyards. Women sold matches and flowers for pennies or resorted to prostitution to fill their bellies. Families wasted away in workhouses and rotted in rookeries. The very embodiment of this enduring suffering can be seen in the infamous murders of 1888. That year, a string of brutal killings shocked the city and cast a global spotlight on the festering underbelly of the empire's capital. At least 5 women, all poor prostitutes scraped from the streets of Whitechapel, were viciously murdered and mutilated by a shadowy figure who taunted police with mocking letters signed, "Jack the Ripper." The Ripper's savage crimes and the fumbling failure of authorities to catch the culprit embodied both the vulnerability of the underclass and the cruel indifference of the metropolis they struggled to survive in. As the fog swirled and the gaslight flickered over the gothic gloom of those damp autumn nights, one could almost imagine the city as a single organism pulsing with life and death, indifferent to the insignificant souls swallowed up in its bowels. The ragged woman who drew her last breath in a dim alley with a knife buried in her throat was just one more scrap of human refuse churned up and spat out by the great, groaning machine of empire. The enduring horror and fascination with the Ripper murders, both then and now, is about more than the ghastly violence inflicted on a few unlucky prostitutes. It was the purest distillation of the everyday miseries and dangers that defined life for the poor. The casual cruelties, the crippling want, the gnawing despair that could be ended with the slash of a knife or a plunge into the Thames. The Ripper was never caught, but his victims achieved a grim celebrity in death they never enjoyed in their hard knocks lives. Their images and stories, however distorted and sensationalized, still flicker in the collective memory as a reminder of the human toll exacted by this unforgiving era. They stand in for the thousands of other anonymous sufferers whose tales of woe were left untold and unremembered. But even in these lowest depths of despair, we can find faint glimmers of hope and resilience. The orphan who defied the odds to survive the streets, the weary mother who still mustered a wan smile for her children, the malnourished matchgirl who dared to dream of a better life. Their struggles may have been largely invisible to their wealthier neighbours, lost in the shadows and squalor, but they were no less real or worthy. As the curtain closed on the 19th century and Queen Victoria's long reign, change was slowly creeping over the fog-bound streets of London. New ideas about social welfare and public health were taking root, the first stirrings of a progressive movement that would fully blossom in the 20th century. The old medieval holdover of the workhouse would soon be phased out, replaced by more humane forms of aid. Compulsory education and child labour laws would give more young people a chance at a better future. Of course, poverty and inequality would persist as harsh facts of London life for generations to come, as they still do today. The city may gleam with steel and glass now instead of soot and brick, but the spectre of want still lurks in its corners and crevices. There are still children who go to bed hungry, still exhausted labourers struggling to make ends meet, still forgotten souls huddled in doorways. But perhaps by confronting the cruelties of the past, we can find the courage and conviction to ease the suffering of the present. The voices of Victorian London's poor still whisper to us from across the ages, urging us to do better, to be better, to see the humanity in every face, no matter how begrimed or bedraggled, to remember that a great society is measured not by its wealth and power, but by how it treats its most vulnerable members. So let us take a moment to mourn the hard lives and lonely deaths of those who fell through the cracks of this glittering empire, ground beneath the wheels of progress. Let us acknowledge the pain and the misery etched into the foundations of the modern metropolis. But let us also honor the perseverance and the dignity of those who endured, the unsung survivors who scratched out another day in the face of a world that would have happily forgotten them. Their stories may be lost to time, but their struggles still echo in the very bricks and cobblestones of London town. By listening closely, we can hear them whispering still, in the rattle of the tube, the cries of the gulls along the Thames, the clatter of footsteps down a darkened alley. They are the city's secret heartbeat, its restless ghosts, the faint but unshakable conscience that pricks and pulls beneath the polished surface. Life in Victorian London was brutal, yes, but it was also vibrantly, defiantly human in all its grit and grime and gallows humour. The poor suffered greatly, but they also loved and laughed and carried on, etching out their humble place in this hurtling world as best they could. In their struggles, we can find a bittersweet sort of beauty, a reminder of the quiet heroism of sheer survival against the odds. So the next time you find yourself strolling past the stately monuments and grand edifices of central London, pause for a moment and remember the forgotten multitudes who toiled and bled and died in their shadows. Remember the hawkers and harlots, the mudlarks and matchgirls, the costermongers and the crossing sweepers. Remember the tired faces that once peered out from rags and ruins, the souls swallowed up by hard times and harder fates. Remember that empires are built on the bent backs of the unseen, that one person's glittering progress is another's crushing poverty. Remember the lessons of the past and let them guide us to a future of greater justice and opportunity for every citizen walking or working these storied streets. That is how we can best honor the memory of those who came before. And perhaps in honoring them, we can finally lay some of those restless Victorian ghosts to rest, knowing that their pain mattered, that their lives left a mark, however faint, on this great groaning city. Knowing that the London of today grew out of the foundations they laid, brick by brick and tear by tear. Knowing that we carry their legacy forward, even as we work to build a better world in their wake. Their bones may moulder in the churchyards, their names may be lost to the ages, but they are still with us in spirit, the unknown soldiers of survival, the uncrowned kings and queens of the slums. Let us remember them. Let us mourn them, but above all, let us learn from them. For in their struggles, we can find the seeds of a more compassionate and equitable London, a city that uplifts the lowest and looks after the least, that sees the worth in every soul who walks its winding ways. It's a vision the Victorians themselves could scarcely have imagined as they scurried through the shadows, but one we must strive for still, with all the grit and resilience of those who came before us. One where no child goes hungry, no worker fears for their safety, no soul is left to waste away in want and despair. A London and a world that belongs to everyone, forged in the fires of empathy and understanding. May that be the true legacy of this tumultuous time, not the darkness, but the light that glimmered stubbornly through the gloom, guiding us onward. Not the suffering, but the spirit that somehow rose above. Not the brutality, but the humanity that could never be broken. No matter how hard the times, no matter how long the odds. A humanity that still shines out to us across the centuries, luminous and unquenchable, lighting the way to a brighter tomorrow for all who follow in those faded footsteps. The terrifying crimes of Jack the Ripper cast a dark pall over the streets of Victorian London in 1888. Against the eerie backdrop of swirling fog and flickering gaslight, a faceless murderer stalked the back alleys and shadowy corners of the impoverished East End. The Ripper's grisly rampage began in the early morning hours of August 31st. A carman, on his way to work, stumbled upon the crumpled body of Mary Ann Nichols, sprawled in a pool of blood, on the cobblestones of Bucks Row. Nichols, known as Polly to her friends, was one of countless women forced to resort to a life of prostitution in the hardscrabble neighborhood of Whitechapel. Her killer had slashed her throat to the bone with 2 deep cuts, nearly severing her head, before turning the blade on her abdomen with vicious, jagged mutilation. Polly Nichols was but the first of 5 desperate women who fell victim to the Ripper's reign of terror that autumn. Their broken bodies turned up like clockwork, each one more brutally butchered than the last. Annie Chapman in the backyard of Hanbury Street, Elizabeth Stride in Dutfield's Yard, Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square, and finally, young Mary Jane Kelly in the dingy room where she lived and worked on Miller's Court. As the bodies piled up and the press churned out lurid headlines and gory details, a ripperologist frenzy gripped the public imagination. The crude, surgical nature of the killings led many to speculate the murderer possessed anatomical knowledge. Perhaps a doctor, surgeon, or medical student. Vigilante groups and private citizens prowled the streets in search of suspicious characters. Anyone seemed a potential suspect in the fog of fear and rumor swirling through the city. The Metropolitan Police, in over their head with such ghastly crimes, struggled mightily to identify the killer. The Ripper seemed to strike with impunity, then melt into the shadows of the slums. In truth, the police faced a daunting challenge, up against a tangled warren of bleak rooming houses, narrow alleyways, dank courts and decrepit tenements. The East Enders themselves were a transient and insular lot, distrustful of authority and often reluctant to cooperate. Inspector Frederick Aberline, a seasoned detective, led the increasingly desperate hunt for the Ripper. Theories and tips by the hundreds poured in from a riveted public. One lead centered on an American quack doctor named Francis Tumblety, who had skipped bail and fled to the States just as the murders reached their grisly peak. Others suspected a Jewish bootmaker named John Pizer or a deranged medical student named Montague Druitt. The most tantalizing clues may have come directly from the Ripper himself. In a chilling letter known as the From Hell missive, the writer taunted the police and claimed to have fried and eaten half a human kidney, promising to send the bloody knife in due time. Was this the authentic voice of a depraved killer or one of countless hoaxes? We may never know for certain. In time, as suddenly as they began, the Ripper's bloody crimes halted in the chill of November 1888. Why the killer ceased his rampage is as much a mystery as his identity. Perhaps he succumbed to injury or illness himself. Perhaps he was institutionalized for madness, imprisoned for other crimes, or fled, never to kill again. Whatever the reason, the Ripper was never unmasked, never brought to justice for his heinous deeds. For all the terror he sowed in his time, Jack the Ripper's enduring legacy is to have shone a light on the dark underbelly of Victorian London. His faceless crimes laid bare the wretched conditions and heartbreaking vulnerability of the poor, especially women, eking out a meagre living in the abyss of society. The Ripper murders were a lurid wake-up call to the 2 starkly different cities coexisting side by side. One, a glittering capital of wealth and empire, the other a fetid world of deprivation and despair. While the poor had always suffered in the shadows of the slums, the Ripper killings splashed their plight across the headlines in gruesome detail. In death, the tragic victims, Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Mary Jane, gave a silent voice to the voiceless. Their spilled blood cried out from the cobblestones for the world to bear witness to life in the gutter of the great metropolis. Even without a face or a name, Jack the Ripper became the ghoulish embodiment of all the cruelty, vice, and inhumanity festering beneath the genteel veneer of Victorian society. The murders exposed a literal ripping of that carefully cultivated facade, forcing London to confront the misery it had long failed to alleviate for its most vulnerable citizens. Painfully, Slowly, the first seeds of social progress and reform began to germinate in the aftermath of horror. So the Ripper, whoever he was, faded into the fog and passed from man to myth. But his blood-soaked crimes still echo through the centuries, an awful reminder of the steep human cost of unchecked urban poverty and despair. The women he cut down in their prime will forever haunt the alleys of Whitechapel and the conscience of a city that once simply turned a blind eye to their struggle. Even today, as we walk the streets Jack once stalked, we can't help but shudder at his memory, and perhaps spare a thought for those who still dwell in the shadows of great cities, forever dreaming of a better life just out of reach. For the Victorians, the harsh reality of death was a constant spectre lurking over daily life in London. Indeed, they held an ironic reverence for the trappings and rituals of death, even as they strived to avoid its cold grasp at all costs. In an age when disease ran rampant, life expectancy hovered around a mere 40 years, and medical care remained woefully rudimentary, the Grim Reaper's scythe was never far from the doorstep. No one embodied the Victorian obsession with death and mourning more fully than Queen Victoria herself. When her beloved husband Prince Albert succumbed to typhoid fever at the age of 42, the devastated Queen plunged into deep mourning from which she never fully emerged. For the remaining 40 years of her reign, Victoria only wore black, earned the moniker the Widow of Windsor, and retreated into seclusion in her private residences, rarely appearing in public. In an era when social customs were rigid and appearance was paramount, even grieving fell victim to strict etiquette and protocols, especially among the upper classes. Mourning clothes were a must for the bereaved. Widows were expected to wear full black widow's weeds, with heavy veils for up to 4 years after their loss. Even the servants changed into mourning livery. Often the deceased remained in the family home for days before burial, while loved ones paid their respects. Mirrors were covered in black crepe. Clocks stopped at the time of death. Lavish funerals and grand processions to the cemetery became displays of wealth and status. No expense was spared on ornately carved coffins, mountains of funeral flowers, hired mutes and professional mourners clad in black to swell the ranks of attendees. Morbid mementos of the dearly departed were coveted and cherished. Locks of hair snipped from the dead were woven into lockets and rings. Stark photos of the deceased, artfully arranged on their deathbeds, became precious keepsakes, a phenomenon known as memento mori, Latin for "remember you must die." Advertisers capitalized on the constant shadow of death, hawking everything from black-bordered stationery and handkerchiefs to special funeral biscuits. For London's poorer inhabitants, even a good death was a luxury far beyond reach. The overcrowded slums and wretched rooming houses of the East End witnessed an endless tide of anonymous souls slipping away on soiled mattresses or mouldering straw without a loving hand to ease their passing. Babies perished from malnutrition, children succumbed to diphtheria, adults wasted away from typhus, cholera, or consumption. Death was a daily occurrence, unremarkable and unmourned. With only threadbare rags on their backs, few of the lower classes could afford the pomp of a proper burial. Instead, the dead were laid out in their meagre dwellings, often among the living, until someone could scrounge together a few shillings for the undertaker. Then the body was carted off for a hasty, no-frills interment in one of London's sprawling, squalid graveyards. At the start of the Victorian era, even many large cemeteries lacked adequate space to properly bury the indigent and poor. Older churchyard cemeteries, particularly in teeming neighbourhoods like St Giles and Southwark, had been packed with bodies for centuries. Fresh remains were simply dumped into shallow graves, dug among the jumbled bones of the long-forgotten. Only later did the city establish new park-like cemeteries outside the central core to provide more room and dignity for the dead. Still, even in their final rest, the poor remained vulnerable to those who would exploit and defile them. Enter the resurrectionists, or body snatchers. Those grave-robbing miscreants who plundered fresh corpses from their coffins to sell to anatomists and medical students. Until the Anatomy Act of 1832, only the bodies of executed criminals could be legally dissected. The resurrectionists helped meet the brisk demand for black market cadavers. While the body-snatching trade put a few extra coins in the pockets of London's poor, it only added to the macabre pall hanging over their hard-scrabble existence. The knowledge that one might be snatched from the grave and end up on a dissection table was a final, degrading insult. Even in death, there was no peace or dignity for those who lived and died in the gutters of the great metropolis. Ironically, just as the wealthy and poor faced vastly different realities in life, so too did their ultimate fates diverge in death. For the affluent, the end of life was an opportunity for one last ornate display of status and refined sentiment. For the destitute, death was but a last cruel joke, a ticket from one wretched hole in the ground to the next, with their eternal rest at the mercy of the highest bidder. Such was the lot of London's poor, from cradle to grave. Opium, a potent narcotic derived from poppy flowers and imported in huge quantities from British India, offered the poor of London a tantalising escape from their daily drudgery and despair. For a few shillings, a man could drift away for hours or days in a dark, candle-lit room, sprawled on a stained, threadbare mattress, lost in a hazy reverie as the sweet, slightly metallic smoke filled his lungs and dulled his senses. The opium dens that dotted the shadowy back alleys of the East End catered to dockers, sailors and labourers, looking to numb the aches and pains wrought by merciless 16-hour workdays, hauling crates on the bustling docks or toiling in one of the city's noxious factories. These gloomy, cramped hovels were shrouded in a thick fug of blue-grey smoke and the sour reek of unwashed bodies. Men lay draped over tattered couches and low bunks, their blank faces lit by the flickers of guttering candles, empty clay pipes dangling from their fingers. For the opium eaters, as they were sometimes known, the drug was a welcome oblivion, smoked or sipped in the form of velvety black laudanum, the tincture cloaking their bleak lives in a gossamer veil of tranquility and strange visions. But that respite came at a steep cost, racking withdrawals, wrecked health, and ruinous cravings that drove some to thievery and madness. Addiction shattered families and left many in even deeper penury. The popularity of opium, especially in London's impoverished quarters, was in part an outgrowth of Victorian attitudes towards intoxication. While hard spirits like gin had long been the more common balm of the working classes, drunkenness, especially public inebriation, carried a social stigma among the middle and upper classes. Opium dens, secretive and discreet by necessity, allowed one to indulge with less risk of public censure or shame. Indeed, the Victorians took a remarkably laissez-faire view of narcotics, with few legal restrictions on their sale and use. Opium-based preparations like laudanum and Godfrey's cordial were readily available from chemists and used to soothe a wide range of ailments from toothaches to colicky babies. Many genteel ladies habitually dosed themselves with laudanum, a refined woman's vice carried out behind closed doors. But in the dank opium dens catering to the lower orders of society, there was little gentility to be found. These were desperate people seeking solace by any means from lives of grinding poverty and joyless labour. For many, the temporary transport offered by the poppy was worth whatever miseries might follow. Another hardship to bear in a life shaped by hardship. A small mercy in a city that offered them few. The opium den on Bluegate Fields was typical of its ilk, a ramshackle two-storey house on a fetid, narrow lane, not far from the Rotherhithe docks. Its faded whitewash was stained with soot and grime, the dim windows caked with dust and dead flies. A tarnished brass knocker in the shape of a clenched fist hung on the battered front door, a portal to dreams and nightmares. Late one night, a haggard young docker named Johnny staggered up to its threshold, fumbling in his pockets for a few grimy shillings. His meagre pay after a brutal day unloading tea chests and bales of silk from a steamer out of Calcutta. His head throbbed and his back ached fiercely where a massive crate had slammed him against the bulkhead, nearly knocking him senseless. His boots had a gaping hole where a rusted nail had gouged his sole, and rainwater squelched unpleasantly between his toes with each step. Johnny had a wife and new baby daughter lodged in a shabby room on Flower and Dean Street. Little Eliza had been born blue and underweight 3 months ago and still wailed thinly day and night. His wife Jenny was wan and worn down, her youthful bloom faded like a hand-me-down frock. He knew he should bring them his few shillings for food and coal. The baby needed milk, and there was precious little in the larder but mouldy bread crusts and a knob of hard cheese. But the promise of sweet oblivion called to him like a siren song, impossible to resist. Just one night's respite from the gnawing of his empty belly and the stabbing pains in his battered limbs and the whimpers of his hungry child. Was that so much to ask from this world that seemed to begrudge him even a moment's peace? He would make it up to them tomorrow, he swore, just like he always swore. Jenny would scold and weep, but she'd forgive him, she always did. He knocked on the door, the brass fist beating a fateful tattoo. Inside, the proprietor, a skeletal Chinaman named Chung Yi, nodded wordlessly and gestured Johnny upstairs. The room was dusty and crowded with worn, rickety furniture, its peeling walls stained with the residue of 1,000 smoking sessions. Low couches upholstered in faded red velvet ringed the space, scattered with limp, stained cushions. The windows were veiled with heavy black curtains that muffled the street noise and held the curling opium fumes inside the room like swirling spectres. A few other men, dull-eyed and lethargic, sprawled gingerly on the sofas, or slumped against the wall, arms trailing over the sides of the couches, drifting in their private reveries. One grizzled sailor type appeared deep in some troubled dream, limbs twitching spasmodically as he muttered what sounded like Malay beneath his ravaged whiskers. Another younger man with hollow blue eyes gazed vacantly at dust motes dancing in the bars of street lamplight that peeked between a gap in the curtains. The room was silent, save for the creak of a couch spring and the faint gurgle of bubbling water. Chung settled Johnny on a faded divan and brought him a delicate long-stemmed pipe of polished ebony inlaid with silver and a lump of sticky brown opium paste on a tarnished tray. He showed Johnny how to twirl the gummy ball on the end of a long needle over the hissing flame of an oil lamp until it softened and sizzled. The resinous smoke, harsh and bittersweet, seemed to coat his tongue and throat as Johnny sucked it deep into his lungs. His eyes watered and his head swam as the narcotic worked its way into his blood and brain, a warm honey glow spreading through his weary body and gentling his various aches and pangs. His limbs felt weighted and sluggish, yet oddly untethered, as if he were sinking into the couch cushions and floating above them at the same time. The dingy room blurred and bent at the edges of his sight, then resolved into intricate gem-like facets of colour and light, an undulating kaleidoscope more vivid and fantastic than anything he'd ever seen sober. The hemp rope hauled over his aching shoulders that day became chains of gold and silver. The smashed and rotting oranges he'd swept off the dock morphed into glowing orbs pulsing with an inner fire. His crying daughter's face shimmered like a mirage, now smiling and ruddy-cheeked, now wizened and ancient, slipping in and out of focus. Her whimpers dopplered into peals of tinkling laughter, and then the faraway keening of gulls. The squalor and sadness and smoke seemed very distant now, like a half-remembered bad dream from which he'd gratefully awoken, Johnny let the beautiful visions wash over him in waves as he reclined on the lumpy divan, feeling the sticky residue of the opium pipe between his calloused fingers. The chill and damp of the room, the stale smells of sweat and smoke and dust, the gnawing of his empty stomach, all faded into insignificance against the billowing, phantasmagoric backdrop unfurling behind his eyelids. His breathing slowed, and his face slackened into a blissful blank as he succumbed fully to the powerful drug singing in his veins. But all too soon, the colours began to leach out of the hallucinatory tableaus, and a grey fog crept in around the edges of Johnny's consciousness. His limbs felt heavy and foreign, his tongue thick and dry as cotton batting in his mouth. Nausea rolled greasily in his gut, and his head pounded in time with his labouring heart. The glorious visions receded into the grim and grimy walls of the opium den as cruel reality reasserted itself. Chung Yi materialised at Johnny's side with a knowing look, holding out the pipe and another bit of sticky brown opium. Just a spot more to stave off the dreaded sickness that crashed in after the high, he seemed to promise. A little hair of the dragon that bit you to keep its teeth at bay a bit longer. Johnny reached for it eagerly, his fingers trembling, craving the surcease of pain and misery that only the opium could grant him. The hours slid by in an endless cycle of bitter smoke and cloying dreams, the room filling and emptying with hollow-eyed wraiths as the night bled into a grey and dismal dawn. At some point, Johnny stumbled down the stairs and out into the filthy alley, retching weakly as the cold light stung his eyes. He felt wretched and empty, wrung out like a damp rag, but a blessed numbness still cocooned his mind and body against the sharp edges of the world and his unhappy life. He turned for home on unsteady legs to face Jenny's tear-streaked reproaches and little Eliza's thin, hungry cries. The fleeting glimpse of beautiful oblivion was worth any recriminations they could heap upon his aching head. He had no coin left for food, but tomorrow he would earn more on the docks, and then perhaps a bit of bread and milk for his girls. And maybe, if he was lucky, a few extra shillings for another night's blessed escape in the den of dreams. It was a vicious cycle, a trap that held him more securely than any chains, but Johnny was too tired and beaten down to contemplate breaking it. The poppy was a harsh mistress, but she was the only comfort he could afford in this hard and unforgiving world. So it went for countless wretches like Johnny in the opium dens of London's squalid East End, a fleeting respite from the pain of poverty and an even more devastating addiction to numb that pain. The opium trade, fueled by imperial conquest and commercial greed, preyed on misery and despair. The same tall ships that brought the city wealth and global power in their holds left ruin and broken lives in their wake. Victorian London gleamed on the surface, while its poorest citizens sank ever deeper into a chemical and economic bondage from which there was little hope of escape. Some of those hopes found outlet in cheap fiery gin, the anaesthetic of the urban poor for generations before the opium pipe arrived from the Orient. For a few pennies, a person could get roaring drunk amid the garish gaslight and tawdry glamour of a London gin palace. These plush drinking dens were designed to lure the working classes with their promise of affordable luxury and quick intoxication. Ornate brass fittings, gleaming mahogany counters, and etched glass lamps winked and glittered, creating an air of tinselly opulence. Smartly uniformed barmen dispensed gin in heavy cut-glass tumblers. Massive mirrors behind the bar multiplied their reflections into an infinite sparkling regression, a visual illusion of prosperity and plenty. Potted palms and ferns added a splash of exotic greenery, while polished brass spittoons invited the copious expectoration common to enthusiastic gin drinkers. Patrons clustered in booths upholstered in red plush or leaned unsteadily against the long bar, quaffing the cheap but potent spirits with abandon. Hungry children with hopeful eyes lurked outside, waiting for tipsy parents to emerge with gin-fueled generosity. Cries of "Gin ho!" and off-key snatches of popular songs pierced the beery, smoky haze. Coarse laughter and the clink of glasses created a cacophonous backdrop to 1,000 sodden conversations and bleary-eyed flirtations. The White Hart Gin Palace on the corner of Whitechapel High Street and Osborne Street was a brightly blazing beacon in that run-down rookery, its gaslight spilling out onto the wet cobblestones. Inside, the mirrored mahogany bar gleamed beneath hanging lamps of ruby red and emerald green glass. The fug of stale beer, sweat, cheap perfume and coal smoke combined into a pungent melange that seared the nostrils and stung the eyes. Fanny Chapman leaned heavily against the long bar, one button boot tapping the gleaming brass footrail. She clutched her gin tumbler with a pale, thin hand, wrist braceleted with faded bruises. Her dark hair straggled in lank tendrils from beneath a dented and bedraggled bonnet trimmed with sad, crushed velvet flowers. The hollows beneath her sharp cheekbones were painted clumsily with rouge, her brown eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and smudged with cheap coal. At just 22, Fanny had already endured a lifetime's worth of misery. She'd lost both parents to typhus by age 12, leaving her to fend for herself as a scullery maid in the employ of a tyrannical cook. By 16, repeated sexual assaults by the cook's loutish son drove Fanny into the street, where starvation and desperation led her into the degrading trade of prostitution. She'd borne 2 stillborn babies and weathered innumerable cruelties from rough, uncaring customers. Now she clung to gin like a life raft, drinking to oblivion to blot out the memories of loss and brutality. Men's eyes crawled lecherously over Fanny's underfed form as she stood swaying slightly, her black bombazine skirts rustling. She was pretty in a hard, sharp-featured way, but her eyes held a dullness, the flat, weary gaze of one who had long ago abandoned any tender feelings. The gin blunted the edges of her disgust and despair, unfurling a welcome numbness that swaddled her ragged nerves. She gulped the last of the clear, burning liquid from her smudged glass and signalled to the unsmiling barman for another. Fanny was dimly aware of a large figure sidling up to the bar next to her, a whiff of horse manure, leather and stale sweat assailing her nostrils. She ignored the intrusion, focusing blearily on the fresh tumbler of gin the barman plunked down in front of her. The man leaned in, his beery breath hot on her neck. "Watcha, darling. Fancy a bit of company? You look like you could use some cheering up." She turned reluctantly, fixing the stranger with a baleful glare. He was a beefy cove in a shabby leather coachman's coat and crushed beaver hat, his broad, florid face split by a gap-toothed leer. "I ain't your darling," she said coldly, "and I got all the company I need right here." She raised her glass in a mocking toast before knocking back a healthy swig. The coachman chuckled, undeterred. "What, old Mother Geneva? She's a harsh mistress, or so I hear tell. Might be I can offer you something a bit warmer and friendlier if you take my meaning." His ham-sized hand crept toward Fanny's arm, thick fingers furred with ginger hair. She flinched away from his touch, revulsion rising like gorge in her throat. "Get your filthy hooks off me, you bleeding sod," she snarled. "I ain't in the mood for the likes of you." Her free hand strayed toward the cheap pocket knife concealed in her skirts, a precaution born of hard experience on the streets. The man's face darkened with anger, and he grabbed for her again, fingers closing around her bruised wrist. She yelped in pain as he yanked her roughly against him, her gin slopping over the side of the glass. "You'll be in whatever mood I tell you to be in, you little slag," he growled. "I got's a bob in me pocket what says you'll be agreeable. Quick enough." Fanny writhed in his grip, the knife forgotten as panic bloomed in her gin-soaked brain. She flung the remains of her drink full in the brute's face, making him roar and loosen his hold for a precious instant. Wrenching free, she bolted for the baize-covered door, the coachman's curses echoing behind her as she plunged out into the foggy street. She ran blindly, skirts hiked up around her skinny, the The Thames was more than just a river to young mudlarks like Jack. It was a lifeline, a place to scrape out a meagre living by scavenging bits of coal, wood, and whatever small treasures the tides brought in. Every morning at dawn, Jack would make his way down to the riverbanks, his bare feet navigating the slippery stones and shards of glass. The pungent smell of sewage and rotting debris hung thick in the air, but Jack was used to it. This was his world, a far cry from the grand houses and glittering shops of the West End. As the murky water receded, exposing the muddy banks, Jack and the other mudlarks got to work. They bent over, their small hands picking through the muck for anything of value. On a good day, Jack might find a few pennies or a scrap of metal to sell. But more often than not, his pockets remained empty, his stomach growling with hunger. When the tide was out, Jack sometimes ventured down into the city's labyrinthine sewers as a tosher, hoping to find money or jewelry that had been accidentally dropped or flushed away. It was treacherous work, wading through the foul water and waste in the dark, dank tunnels. The risk of drowning was ever present, with flash floods from sudden rainstorms that could fill the sewers in minutes. And yet for children like Jack, the sewers offered a glimmer of hope, a chance to find something valuable amidst the filth. As the sun rose higher and the streets of London began to stir, Jack would emerge from the riverbanks, his skin caked with grime, his clothes damp and ragged. He was just one of countless poor children, scratching out a living on the margins of the great city. For them, childhood was not a time of innocence and play, but a daily battle for survival. Across London, the great engines of industry were stirring to life. The factories, sweatshops, and workhouses that powered the British Empire. The poor were the fuel that kept the machines running, their labour cheap and expendable. And when they could no longer work, when sickness or injury or old age took hold, the workhouses awaited them. These grim institutions, built to shelter the destitute, were little better than prisons. Behind their foreboding walls, the poor were stripped of their dignity and possessions, forced to wear uniforms and submit to strict rules and hard labour in exchange for a roof over their heads and a bowl of thin gruel. Families were ruthlessly separated, husbands from wives, parents from children. Many entered a workhouse never to see their loved ones again. They toiled in the oakum sheds, picking apart old ropes until their fingers bled, or broke stones until their backs ached, all for a meagre subsistence that kept them barely alive. One young woman, Annie Chapman, found herself in the harsh confines of a workhouse as a teenager. Born into poverty, Annie had turned to prostitution to survive, walking the streets of Whitechapel nightly. The workhouse must have seemed a welcome respite from the dangers and degradations she faced. But Annie could not know the grim fate that awaited her. Years later, her body would be found brutally mutilated, her throat slashed, in the shadows of a Whitechapel yard, one of the first victims of the notorious Jack the Ripper. The spectre of the Ripper would soon stalk the gaslit streets, striking terror into the hearts of London's underclass. For now, though, the business of the great city lurched forward, heedless of the suffering in its midst. The London docks teemed with ships from every corner of the globe, their holds bursting with the wealth of the British Empire. Tea from India, silk from China, rubber from Malaya, cocoa from Africa. An army of dockworkers toiled to unload the precious cargo. Lascars from Bengal, Irish navvies, East End costermongers. They laboured for long hours in all weather, their bodies straining under heavy loads, always one accident or injury away from destitution. The docks were a place of sweat and blood, of groaning winches and shouted oaths in a babel of languages. Accidents were common and lives were cheap. In 1852, an iron barge carrying barrels of coal tipped over at Cuckold's Point. 8 men were trapped beneath the hull, screaming and pounding as the Thames rushed in. By the time they were brought up, 6 had drowned and 2 were barely alive, coughing up the dark, filthy water. Such scenes were all too ordinary along the bustling Thames quays. The hunger for profit overpowered any concern for human life. There was always a fresh supply of desperate labourers willing to risk their necks for a day's pay. In the sweatshops of the East End, the poor toiled under equally wretched conditions. Huddled over sewing machines in close, airless rooms rank with the stench of sweat and cheap gin, women and children worked up to 16 hours a day, stitching endless shirts and trousers for the fashionable shops of Regent Street. Their eyes strained in the dim light, their lungs choked with lint and dust. Badly nourished and overworked, they easily fell victim to disease. Tuberculosis, known as Taylor's disease, cut a brutal swath through the crowded slums. One of the most notorious trades for women was matchstick making. In dark, cramped factories, rows of pale matchgirls deftly dipped the slender wooden sticks into vats of white phosphorus, their skin absorbing the terrible poison with every breath. Many developed the dreaded phossy jaw, a horrific disfigurement that slowly ate away their teeth and bones. The plight of the matchgirls gained national attention in 1888, when activist Annie Besant published a damning exposé of the working conditions at the Bryant and May factory. Besant described girls as young as 12 toiling 14 hours a day for a pittance, their gums bleeding and their hair falling out from phosphorus exposure. Public outrage over this white slavery eventually led to the famous Match Girls strike and some modest reforms. But life for most factory workers remained a bleak cycle of overwork and illness, their brief lives snuffed out like matchsticks. They were cogs in the great machines of empire, easily replaced when broken or worn down. As darkness fell over the crooked streets of the East End, the gin palaces and opium dens came alive, glittering oases of oblivion for the downtrodden. For those with a few pennies in their pockets, the gin shops offered a chance to drown their sorrows in cheap spirits. Drunkenness was rampant, a nightly escape from the miseries of the slums. In dimly lit back rooms, hollow-eyed men sprawled on stained mattresses, opium pipes dangling from their lips. These wretched dens offered another kind of escape, a hazy, dreamless sleep, free from the gnawing of hunger and despair. Here Chinese sailors mingled with English prostitutes and the occasional slumming gentleman seeking a walk on the wild side. Opium itself was a slippery slope. At first, just a balm for aching bodies and troubled minds, its tendrils would slowly tighten, trapping the user in a nightmare of addiction. Dens multiplied in the 1870s as opium, imported by the ton from British-ruled India, flowed freely. Many a man who wandered in seeking temporary relief would remain lost in a fog of smoke and lotus dreams. As the hour grew late, and the thick, sulphurous fog swirled through the labyrinth of East End alleys, the shadow of the Ripper loomed large. Women walked quickly, darting fearful looks over their shoulders. Men clutched bludgeons and huddled in doorways, ears pricked for the echo of footsteps on damp cobblestones. The Ripper murders had cast a pall of morbid fascination and dread over the city. Tabloids churned out lurid stories of the depraved killer stalking the foggy streets, preying on fallen women. Wild theories and dark suspicions swirled. Was the Ripper a doctor, a butcher, a gentleman gone mad with syphilitic delusions? For the poor of the East End, the Ripper was just one more spectre in a life hemmed in by dangers. The women he killed were their sisters in suffering, their fates a reminder of how little their lives mattered. In the eyes of respectable society, they were the disposable ones, streetwalkers and alley sluts, their deaths a sordid footnote easily forgotten. But even as the Ripper's bladed shadow faded with time, the bone-deep weariness and despair remained. Children still picked through the Thames muck for scraps. Women still stitched until their fingers cramped and their eyes dimmed. Men still broke their backs on the docks and drank themselves into early graves. This was the London that the Victorian upper classes rarely saw, or wanted to see. A world away from their airy parks and glittering salons. Here there was no genteel promenade, no shimmering silk and polished carriages and delicate china teacups. Only the endless struggle to survive another day. A few intrepid souls dared to lift the veil and peer into this shadow world. Writers like Charles Dickens and Henry Mayhew chronicled the squalor and heartbreak of the slums, giving voice to the voiceless. Their words ignited both pity and morbid curiosity among the drawing room set. In the 1880s, the peculiar fad of slumming emerged. Parties of well-heeled men and women would don old clothes and venture into the East End as if on safari, gawking at the residents and exclaiming over the quaint sights of poverty. For them, it was an evening's diversion, a thrilling glimpse of how the other half lived. They would return to their comfortable homes titillated but ultimately untroubled, the desperation and deprivation quickly forgotten. But even as the fashionable slummers came and went, there were those who looked at the suffering of the poor with genuine alarm and conviction. A rising chorus of reformers, philanthropists, and progressive thinkers were beginning to argue that such misery had no place in a civilized society, that even the lowliest dock worker or matchstick girl deserved dignity and a chance at a better life. One unlikely hero who emerged was an unassuming engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. In the sweltering summer of 1858, the stench of raw sewage in the Thames had grown so overpowering that it threatened to shut down the workings of the government. The Great Stink, as it was known, could not be ignored by even the most sheltered aristocrat. Bazalgette had a bold plan: to build a vast network of underground brick sewers that would carry waste safely downriver, far from the city's heart. It was a mammoth undertaking that would ultimately stretch over 1,100 miles and take nearly 20 years to complete. The engineer faced ridicule and resistance from many quarters. The cost was astronomical, and the disruption to the city would be immense. Many could not fathom how the problems of the poor could possibly be connected to the elegant avenues and grand monuments of the West End. But Bazalgette persisted, and the great work inched forward. Tunnels were dug, pipes laid, reservoirs and pumping stations constructed. Slowly but surely, the fetid streets of old London were vanishing, replaced by a hidden world of engineering marvels that would serve the city for generations to come. It was just one step on the long road to progress. Over the coming decades, children would gain the right to a basic education. Housing reformers would begin to clear the worst of the slums and build new model dwellings. Labour laws would curb the worst abuses in factories and mines. Change came in fits and starts, the old ways stubbornly clinging like a dank fog. There would be many steps back for every hard-won stride forward. The poor would remain, their struggles still desperate, their burdens still heavy. But a corner had been turned. A quiet revolution set into motion. The cold Victorian heart was beginning to thaw, to contemplate its own complicity in the suffering of the many. If Dickens and Mayhew had helped to prick the conscience of the age, then it was the clamour of match girls and dockers, the scolding of labour activists, and the unstinting work of reformers that would begin to reshape the social landscape. They were the little match flames, bravely sputtering to life, casting the first fragile light into the gloom. Even the wretched of the East End began to stir and imagine that a different future was possible, that their children might one day walk taller and breathe more freely than they ever had, that the great groaning machinery of industry and empire could yield a portion of its plenty to those who kept it running. It was a dream still decades from fulfillment, a hope shadowed by the stubborn realities of class and custom. Many would not live to see its fruits. The mudlarks would keep scrounging, and the matchgirls would keep sickening. The hungry and forsaken would keep scratching and gasping through the soot-choked alleys. But even so, a flicker of light persisted, a sense that the tide of times was shifting, however slowly, that the hard, gem-like flame of common humanity could not be endlessly quenched, however fierce the forces arrayed against it. That a great and grim city might yet learn to measure its true wealth in the health and hope of its humblest citizens. And so we leave the gaslit streets of old London, the child labourer and the hunched seamstress, the tubercular docker and the shivering prostitute. We step out of the sepia shades of the past and back into our own day, hopefully a bit wiser and more tender-hearted for the journey. The struggles of those whose weary feet trod those cobblestones are not entirely behind us. The injustices they faced echo in our own time, wearing different guises but cutting just as deep. The shadows of poverty and despair still linger, even amid the bright lights of our modern age. But we can look to the East Enders of old and take heart from their resilience in the face of crushing odds, from their refusal to be ground down, to accept the fate handed to them, from the way they lifted each other up in small unsung acts of grace and solidarity. We can let their memory be a spur to our own empathy and action, to never look away from suffering, to never grow complacent or callous in the face of want, to believe that no soul is disposable and no child's future foreclosed by the accident of birth. This is their legacy to us, carried forward on the mists of time. A reminder that the true measure of a society is not in the height of its glittering spires, but in the depths of its compassion for those in the shadows. That there is no grandeur without mercy, no true progress that leaves its most vulnerable behind. So let us carry their flickering flame forward, these long ago wretched of the earth. Let the light of their humanity be a beacon in our own striving for a world where every child may know safety and plenty, every worker dignity and reward, where the bright promise of great cities is a birthright for all, not a distant gleam beyond the grimy pane. This is the task left to us by the bones and ashes of old London, to take up the hard, unfinished work of bending the arc of history towards justice, to mend what is broken and lift up what is laid low, to craft a future worthy of those whose toil and tears laid the foundation stones, however unwillingly. It's a long twilight struggle, the work of generations. But as we labour on, may we forever carry the memory of the East End poor in our hearts, their sorrows and their small triumphs, their unquenchable spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. In the warp and weft of their lives, roughly woven and too quickly cut short, we may yet find the threads of our own better angels, the pattern of a more luminous tomorrow. The long Victorian night is over, but the dream kindled in those gaslit alleys of a world where every soul might climb free of the smog to greet a brighter dawn remains to us, fragile yet fierce, an inheritance and a sacred charge. May we lift it high and carry it forward, a rushlight against the gloom, until the day when its radiance is undiminished and all the dark corners of human suffering are forever banished to shadow and memory. The East End of London was a notorious den of poverty, grime and vice. Its dark, labyrinthine streets were choked with tenements, the air thick with the stench of human misery. In 1888, this already bleak corner of the metropolis was plunged into a new depth of terror by a string of gruesome murders that sent shockwaves through proper Victorian society. Between August and November of that fateful year, 5 women met horrific ends at the hands of a shadowy figure who came to be known as Jack the Ripper. All the victims were prostitutes who lived and worked in the squalid streets of Whitechapel. Their throats were cut, their bodies savagely mutilated with a surgical precision that led some to speculate the killer had anatomical knowledge, perhaps even being a doctor. The first canonical victim was Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly. Her body was found in the early hours of August 31st in a dark corner of Bucks Row by a cart driver on his way to work. Her throat had been slit twice and her abdomen ripped open, her intestines pulled out and draped over her shoulder. The brutality of the crime was shocking even in an area accustomed to violence. Just over a week later, in the pre-dawn darkness of September 8th, the body of Annie Chapman was discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Her throat had also been cut and her abdomen sliced open, her uterus removed with chilling precision. The murder scene was a tableau of horror, with the yard's wooden fence stained with blood and a crumpled, torn envelope found by Chapman's hand, perhaps dropped in the struggle. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were the next to fall victim in the early hours of September 30th, in what would come to be known as the double event. Stride's body was found in Dutfield's yard off Burner Street, her throat cut, but her body otherwise unmutilated, leading to speculation the killer may have been interrupted. Less than an hour later, Eddowes' brutalized corpse was discovered in Mitre Square, her face mutilated and her intestines pulled out and placed over her right shoulder. The final canonical murder was perhaps the most vicious of all. Mary Jane Kelly was a young, pretty Irish girl, just 25 years old. In the early morning hours of November 9th, in the squalid room where she lived at 13 Miller's Court, Kelly was essentially butchered. Her body was hacked apart, her heart removed, her face unrecognizable. The scene was a charnel house of gore and viscera that even shocked the hardened police who discovered it. The murders whipped up a public frenzy, stoked by the salacious coverage in the penny press. Newspapers offered grisly, lurid details of the crimes, turning the mysterious murderer into a media bogeyman. Hundreds of letters poured into the police, many purporting to be from the killer himself. Some were signed Jack the Ripper, cementing the name in the annals of true crime. The Ripper seemed to be taunting the police, toying with them as he carried out his grisly work. Despite an extensive investigation, the killer was never caught. The police at the time were hampered by the dark maze-like layout of the East End streets and the general public distrust of authority figures. They lacked forensic techniques like fingerprinting and blood typing that could have helped identify the culprit. As the murders faded into history, Jack the Ripper lived on as a boogeyman, a symbol of the darkness lurking in the human heart. The case spawned countless theories, books, and films speculating on the killer's identity and motives. Was he a doctor, a butcher, a member of the royal family, a foreigner? More than 130 years later, the mystery endures. But beyond the morbid fascination and conspiracy theories, the Ripper murders shone a light on the plight of London's poor and the precarious existence of women on the margins of society. The victims were daughters, sisters, mothers, women driven by poverty and desperation into the dangerous world of prostitution. They were preyed upon not just by the Ripper, but by a cruel social order that left them vulnerable and expendable. Even as the police poured resources into the biggest manhunt London had ever seen, the message was clear. The lives of poor women mattered little in Victorian society. Had the victims been wealthy ladies instead of Cockney prostitutes, would the Ripper have been allowed to kill with such impunity? The murders laid bare the stark class divides and misogyny of the time. In death, the Ripper's victims gained an immortality they never found in their difficult lives. Their names, Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, Mary Jane, are forever linked to one of history's most infamous crime sprees. They've become more than just victims. They are symbols of the human toll of poverty and injustice in the shadows of Victorian London. The Ripper murders were the nadir of a metropolis already steeped in suffering. They represented the ultimate horror, faceless evil stalking the very streets where want and despair already held sway. For a few bloody months, the Ripper seemed to embody the darkest ills and inequities of Victorian society, a phantom menace that could strike without warning or mercy. And yet, in a strange way, the murders also marked a turning point. The press coverage and public outcry over the killings helped raise awareness of the plight of London's underclass. The terror the Ripper evoked began to crack the cold Victorian facade of indifference to poverty. There was a growing realization that leaving an entire class of people to languish in squalor and desperation would have grave social consequences. Of course, this awakening of the public conscience did not happen overnight. The poor would struggle and suffer for many decades more. But the Ripper murders were a flashpoint, a grim reminder of the human cost of neglect and injustice. They forced London to confront the Gorgon hidden in the depths of the East End, the nightmare that sprung from the very rot and decay polite society tried so hard to ignore. Today, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains a mystery, an enduring cipher for the darkest impulses of the human soul, but his victims are silent no more. In death, they still have much to tell us of the world they inhabited, the hardships they endured, the small joys and crushing sorrows of lives lived on the knife edge of destitution. Their stories are not for the faint of heart. They speak of a time and place where life for the poor was, in the words of philosopher Thomas Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short. The Ripper was but an exclamation point at the end of that sentence, a monster born of monstrous circumstances. But in remembering the victims and the society that shaped and ultimately failed them, we honor their humanity. We acknowledge the suffering and resilience of those born in the shadows of great wealth and progress. We are reminded that the course of history is so often steered by the forgotten, the unsung, the faces in the crowd. The Ripper's bloody spree in the autumn of 1888 was a heart of darkness for Victorian London, a season of terror that held up a mirror to a society's failings. The murders offered a grim reflection of the vast disparities that defined the era, the cruel social Darwinism that allowed predators to stalk the vulnerable and depraved. But even in the darkest of times, there are glimmers of light. The Ripper murders, for all their horror, helped awaken London's conscience. They stirred the first winds of change that would, slowly but inexorably, begin to ameliorate the lot of the poor. They reminded a society enamored with wealth and progress of its most basic duty, to protect and sustain its most vulnerable members. More than a century later, the spectre of Jack the Ripper still looms large in our collective nightmares. But it is his victims who linger in our conscience, their hard lives and tragic ends, a testament to the human cost of poverty and neglect. In remembering them, we pay tribute to the faceless thousands who shared their plight, the huddled masses whose pain and perseverance built the world we inherit. The Ripper murders were a flashbulb moment, illuminating in chilling detail the darkest recesses of the Victorian psyche. They exposed not just the evil that men do, but the evil that society allows by averting its gaze from suffering. They are a reminder that progress is not just measured in wealth and industry, but in how we treat the least among us. In the end, perhaps that is the true legacy of Jack the Ripper's reign of terror, not just a macabre murder mystery, but a call to vigilance, a warning of the monsters we breed in the shadows of neglect. The Ripper was a demon born of a demon time, a reckoning for a society's sins as much as a man's. And as we lay our heads down to rest, let us spare a thought for Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Mary Jane. The Ripper's victims, but also Victoria's victims, casualties of a society that weighed their worth and found it wanting. In the retelling of their stories, we give them a voice, a place in the tapestry of history. We remember not just how they died, but how they lived, struggling, striving, dreaming, in the face of impossible odds. Their lives and deaths are a testament to the human spirit, to the resilience of those who persist in the darkest of circumstances. They remind us that even in the bleakest of times, hope endures, a light that flickers, but never quite goes out. And in honoring their memory, we keep that flame alive, a beacon to guide us through the shadows of our own uncertain times. So let us remember Jack the Ripper's victims and all the forgotten souls who shared their struggles. Let their stories be not just a morbid fascination, but a call to empathy, to action, to build a world where no one is left to languish in the shadows. That is the true reckoning the Ripper demands of us, a blood debt paid not in terror, but in tears of compassion. As we drift off to sleep, let the ghosts of Victorian London be not just spectres of a dark past, but guardians of a brighter future, silent sentinels urging us to be better, to do better, for all those who share our fleeting moment in the sun. In their whispers, we may yet find the wisdom and the will to build a world where even the humblest among us can walk without fear, where the only shadows are those of tall trees and grand dreams. The slums of London were a world apart from the grand manners and gaslit avenues of the city's wealthy West End. In the teeming tenements and rookeries of neighbourhoods like Whitechapel and Spitalfields, whole families crowded into single rooms with little light, ventilation or sanitation. The fetid streets were choked with rubbish and the waste of humans and animals alike, putrefying into a reeking miasma that bred disease and despair. Imagine yourself as young Jack Lucky Jones, a spry 12-year-old lad, scampering along the muck of the River Thamese's shores at low tide. Jack was a mudlark, one of the many poor children who scavenged the riverbanks for precious scraps of coal, bits of rope, or anything else that could be sold or used. The mud sucked at his bare feet, studded with shattered glass and rusted nails. But Jack's keen eyes and quick hands darted over the debris, hoping to spy a shimmering coin or a scrap of silver amid the filth. Sometimes Jack got lucky. That's how he earned his ironic nickname among the other mudlarks. A shilling here, an old pocket watch there. Once he even found a gold tooth. But more often the pickings were slim, his stomach growling after hours hunched in the muck. On those lean days, Jack might try his hand at being a tosher. A tosher was a scavenger of the sewers, wading through the dark tunnels in search of lost coins, bits of scrap metal, perhaps a silver spoon if he was lucky. It was even filthier, more dangerous work than mudlarking. The stench was overwhelming in the claustrophobic brick passages. Jack ran the risk of drowning if he was caught by a sudden rush of rainwater and sewage. Rats skittered past in the dark, and strange fungi clung to the clammy walls. But when you're hungry, you'll risk quite a lot for a chance at a few farthings to fill your belly. Still, as grim as mudlarking and toshering could be, it was better than the alternative, ending up in the workhouse. The workhouses were supposed to be places of refuge for the poor and destitute, funded by local parishes. But they were run more like prisons than charities. Upon entering a workhouse, the poor were stripped of their personal belongings and freedom. Families were separated, with husbands and wives housed in different wings, and children sent to either the children's ward or industrial schools. Imagine long days of back-breaking work, breaking stone, picking oakum, unravelling old ropes, or sewing rough uniforms. Meals were meagre, often just watery gruel and stale bread. The able-bodied poor were expected to earn their keep through labour. The sick were warehoused in crowded, unsanitary infirmaries, where diseases like typhus ran rampant. The elderly and infirm whiled away their last days in the grim, old people's ward. For most, ending up in the workhouse was a fate barely better than slow starvation on the streets. One woman who knew the misery of the workhouse all too well was Annie Chapman. Born into poverty, Annie had endured a stint in the Dorset workhouse as a young woman before marrying and having children. But her life took a tragic turn when her husband died, leaving her destitute. Like many poor women, she resorted to prostitution to survive, supplementing her meagre earnings as a charwoman. Annie rented a tiny room on Hanbury Street in Spitalfields, bringing back clients to the dingy space she could barely afford. In the pre-dawn hours of September 8th, 1888, her mutilated body was discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Her throat had been slashed down to the bone and her abdomen ripped open, intestines pulled out and arranged over her shoulder. Annie Chapman was the second victim of the most notorious serial killer in history, Jack the Ripper. While Jack prowled the streets that autumn, most East End residents continued their daily drudgery, many of them at the docks or in factories. The Port of London was the beating heart of the British Empire's global trade, with ships from far-flung colonies unloading everything from spices to silk to timber along the bustling wharves. Brawny dockers hauled crates and barrels, dodging clanking cranes and treacherous cargo nets. Accidents were common, limbs crushed or men drowned in the filthy waters between the ships and wharves. But there was always another desperate man waiting to take an injured docker's place for a day's meagre wages. Women and children had it no easier, many of them employed in the East End's infamous sweatshops and match factories. Seamstresses hunched over their machines for 12 hours or more in airless, overcrowded rooms, stitching collars and cuffs for fashionable ladies' gowns. They were paid by the piece, nimble fingers flying to earn perhaps 6 pence for a 16-hour day if they were fast. Many suffered chronic back pain and damaged eyesight from the long hours and poor lighting. But some of the most wretched conditions were endured by the matchstick girls employed at the Bryant and May match factory. In 1888, socialist activist Annie Besant published an exposé called White Slavery in London, detailing the dire straits of these young workers. Girls as young as 12 toiled 14 hours a day in harsh conditions, exposed to the toxic white phosphorus used in match heads. For this dangerous work, they earned a mere 4 shillings a week, with deductions for fines and the cost of their materials. Many of the matchstick girls developed a disfiguring condition known as phossy jaw from the phosphorus fumes. The chemical caused their jawbones to glow a ghostly white in the dark factory and slowly rot away. It was a painful, debilitating affliction that could lead to brain damage and death if untreated. But the Bryant and May Company dismissed concerns, claiming the girls simply had poor hygiene. Besant's articles sparked public outrage over these appalling conditions, seen as a form of white slavery. In July of 1888, the furious matchstick girls went on strike, protesting their treatment. Marching and rallying with the support of Besant and other advocates, the girls became icons for the labour movement. While their gains were modest, the matchstick girls' strike was an early crack in the edifice of unchecked industrial exploitation. A first step on the long road to safer working conditions and fairer wages that would stretch well into the next century. But in the meantime, many of the poor still sought solace and escape in the bottle or the pipe. Gin palaces glittered on many a corner in the East End, promising a brief respite from the drudgery and despair. For a few pennies, a man could drink himself into a stupor, dulling the aches and pains of a long day's labours. Of course, the relief was temporary. Come morning, the gin would be gone, but the wretchedness would remain. And too often, a gin-soaked man might lash out violently, battering his wife or children in a drunken rage. Opium offered another form of oblivion, its fumes wafting from the dark doorways of East End opium dens. Chinese sailors first brought the practice to London's docks, but it quickly spread as a cheap and powerful anaesthetic for the poor. In dim, smoky rooms, hollow-eyed men and women sprawled on grimy mattresses, sucking the drug from delicate pipes as they drifted into hazy, dreamless stupors. Some might disappear into an opium den for days, even weeks, wasting away in a narcotic trance as the world went on without them. Yet even in their desperation, few honest folk of the East End would trade places with the nameless wretches who eked out a living in London's most chilling and forbidden trade, the resurrection men. In a time when the study of anatomy was advancing rapidly, the need for human corpses far outstripped the legal supply. doctors and medical students required a steady stream of cadavers to dissect, but only the bodies of executed murderers could be legally used. So an illicit market emerged, a macabre commerce in stolen corpses dug fresh from paupers' graves. In the dead of night, the resurrection men would creep into graveyards, shovels and sacks in hand. With speed and practiced skill, they unearthed the newly buried, hacking through coffin lids and hauling out the bodies to be whisked away in a cart. A fresh corpse could fetch as much as 10 guineas from a desperate anatomist, a small fortune. The gruesome practice filled the public with dread and revulsion, fears of one's own body being spirited away and desecrated after death. Grieving families of the poor would keep vigil by new graves for days to deter the body snatchers. Iron cages called mort safes were affixed over plots as a grim form of protection. Some even resorted to booby-trapping fresh graves with tripwires and explosives. While the resurrection men plied their grisly trade in the shadows, London high society developed a strange fascination with poverty as entertainment. Slumming became a popular pursuit for the well-to-do, a voyeuristic form of tourism to the meanest streets of the East End. Parties of gentlemen and ladies would hire guides to lead them through the rookeries and tenements, gawking at the squalor and deprivation like visitors to a human zoo. Some even attended special slumming balls where they could dress down as beggars and thieves, play acting at poverty for a night before returning to their comfortable homes. It was a callous kind of thrill-seeking, a way to flirt with the city's underbelly without getting one's hands too dirty. But for reformers and philanthropists, this exposure to the poor's wretched conditions could also be a powerful motivator. Appalled by what he witnessed in the slums, journalist Henry Mayhew made it his life's work to document the realities of London's poor in his landmark book, London Labour and the London Poor. Through vivid interviews and unflinching descriptions, Mayhew brought the struggles of costermongers, street sweepers, rag pickers, and other humble workers to light. His work helped pierce the willful ignorance of the upper classes and spurred social conscience. Writers like Charles Dickens also drew back the curtain on London poverty, using their talents to craft vivid, fictionalized portraits that stirred both sentiment and action. From the workhouse boys of Oliver Twist to the street urchins of Fagin's gang, Dickens put a human face on the sufferings of the poor, particularly children. His immense popularity made him a social justice advocate as much as an entertainer, inspiring reforms and charities. This rising tide of awareness and conscience would slowly, incrementally begin to change Victorian society. Charities and movements sprang up to minister to the poor in both body and soul. The Salvation Army, founded in 1865, embodied this new drive to offer both material aid and spiritual succor. Their motto was soup, soap, and salvation. First tend to the basic needs of the hungry and destitute, then offer them the hope of God's grace. But it would take more than soup and sermons to cure the deep ills of London poverty. Real, lasting progress would require major feats of engineering and political will to create a city that could be livable for all its citizens, rich and poor alike. And in 1858, the stench of human misery that permeated London would become too overwhelming to ignore any longer. They called it the Great Stink. That summer of 1858 was the hottest on record in London, with temperatures soaring above 90 degrees Fahrenheit for days on end. As the mercury rose, so did the stench. The fetid waters of the River Thames, long used as an open sewer, began to cook and ferment in the brutal heat. The result was an ungodly reek that enveloped the city like a noxious fog. At the time, London lacked any kind of comprehensive sewage system. Waste from privies, laundries, and abattoirs simply flowed into ancient storm drains that emptied directly into the Thames. During the Great Stink, the river transformed into a bubbling, putrid stew of human and animal filth. The miasma was so thick and eye-watering that it became known as the monster soup. As the stink intensified, London ground to a halt. Boat traffic on the Thames ceased as no one could bear to be near the revolting river. Judges at the Old Bailey courthouse soaked their handkerchiefs in chloride of lime in a futile attempt to block the smell. Even the newly constructed Houses of Parliament, perched right on the river's banks, became uninhabitable as the stench seeped through the halls and chambers. Members of Parliament discussed moving upriver to escape the noxious vapours. Londoners feared that the Great Stink heralded another outbreak of cholera, which had already claimed tens of thousands of lives in previous years. It was clear that London's haphazard, decentralised approach to waste management was no longer tenable. The Great Stink literally forced Parliament's hand, spurring a monumental public works project that would become one of the great engineering marvels of the Victorian age. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, a visionary engineer who had already distinguished himself working on London's railways and dockyards. In 1856, Bazalgette was appointed chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works and tasked with solving London's sewage crisis once and for all. His ambitious plan called for a vast network of new sewers running for 100 miles beneath London's streets and carrying waste safely downriver, far from the city centre. It was a staggering feat of engineering and construction. Bazalgette's design called for 4 massive interceptor sewers running parallel to the Thames on each side. These cavernous brick tunnels were up to 11 feet wide and would be buried deep underground, using gravity and a series of pumping stations to move the waste. Smaller local sewers would feed into the interceptors, creating a comprehensive system that could handle even the most torrential rains. Building Bazalgette's sewers was a back-breaking, dangerous undertaking. Thousands of workmen laboured around the clock, digging trenches and tunnels by hand through London's streets and riverbanks. They burrowed through ancient plague pits and Roman ruins, shoring up the unstable earth with timber and bricks. Toxic gases and cave-ins claimed the lives of many workers, as did outbreaks of cholera that swept through the rank, sweltering tunnels. But inch by inch, mile by mile, the great sewers took shape. Bazalgette used the London clay excavated from the tunnels to build up the riverbanks, creating the wide, sweeping Thames embankments that would become one of London's most recognisable features. The Victoria, Albert and Chelsea embankments added 52 acres of new prime riverfront real estate, featuring broad thoroughfares and lush gardens. The southern outfall sewer alone stretched for 11 miles, from Deptford to Crossness, where Bazalgette built a magnificent pumping station to eject the waste into the Thames estuary on outgoing tides. With its soaring Gothic turrets and cathedral-like interiors, the Crossness pumping station was a monument to Victorian engineering prowess, a literal cathedral of sanitation. When the new sewer system was completed in 1875, it was hailed as a triumph of human ingenuity over the chaos of nature. The death rate from cholera and other waterborne diseases plummeted as London's drinking water became noticeably cleaner. The Thames began to recover from centuries of abuse, its waters running clearer and fish returning to its depths. Bazalgette's sewers had quite literally saved London from drowning in its own filth. But as monumental an achievement as the sewers were, they alone could not wash away the entrenched poverty and human suffering that still gripped much of London. Real progress would also require a change in the hearts and minds of those in power, a willingness to see the poor as more than an abstract mass to be managed and contained. And slowly but surely, the Victorian conscience was awakening to the plight of the less fortunate. In the squalor of the East End slums, a new kind of hope was taking root. Social reformers and philanthropists were venturing into the depths of poverty, not just to gawk or proselytize, but to listen and understand. They built schools and orphanages, settlement houses and soup kitchens. They fought for child labour laws, public health measures, and decent housing for the working poor. Some of the most unlikely agents of change were London's own poor. banding together to improve their lot through mutual aid societies and labour unions. The women of the Bryant and May Match Factory, once symbolising the depths of industrial exploitation, became the spark for a new labour movement. Their strike in 1888 lit a fire that would spread to other industries, as workers demanded safer conditions, shorter hours, and a living wage. Of course, progress was slow and uneven. The gears of entrenched power and prejudice grind slowly. But the seeds of change had been planted in the fetid soil of London's slums. The misery and degradation of the poor could no longer be ignored or accepted as simply the natural order of things. The old Victorian certainties were crumbling, making way for a new, more humanist age. As the century drew to a close, London remained a city of stark contrasts, glittering wealth and privilege alongside grinding. Jack Jones was just one face among multitudes whose stories have been lost to history. In 1861, social researcher Henry Mayhew estimated there were 100,000 mudlarks alone, scavenging a meagre existence along the filthy Thames riverbanks. With so many of London's poor engaged in such back-breaking, dangerous labour, it's little wonder average life expectancy in the East End was just 29 years, compared to 55 years for the city's upper classes. For those with no other options, a last refuge could be found in London's workhouses. Established under the harsh New Poor Law of 1834, they were deliberately designed to be foreboding and punitive to discourage all but the most desperate. Imagine entering the gloomy, prison-like edifice of the St. Marylebone Workhouse, stripped of your possessions and dignity. Men, women, and children were separated, personal clothes replaced with rough uniforms. Hard labour, strict rules, and meagre meals of thin gruel awaited, all to make poverty as demeaning and unpleasant as possible. One woman who found herself at the mercy of the workhouse system was Annie Chapman. Born in 1841, Annie married at 16 and had 3 children, but descended into alcoholism and destitution after her husband's death. In and out of workhouses, she eventually turned to prostitution to survive, eking out a tenuous existence in the nightly shadow world of Whitechapel. In 1888, the hard luck of Annie's life reached a grisly culmination when her body was discovered brutally mutilated, the second confirmed victim of the notorious Jack the Ripper. Chapman's short, hard-scrabble life and vicious death exemplified the vulnerability and desperation of London's underclass women. For many, what little employment they could find was in the harsh realm of factories and sweatshops. In the suffocating confines of the Bryant and May Match Factory, girls as young as 12 toiled up to 16 hours a day for a pittance in horrendous conditions. Exposure to toxic white phosphorus used in match heads caused many to develop the grotesque deformity known as phossy jaw, as the compound ate away at the bones of their faces. Public awareness of these dangers was raised by social reformer Annie Besant, who published a damning article on the match girls' plight in 1888. She decried the white slavery of such abusive child labour and helped instigate the famous London match girls' strike that year. While small gains were made in pay and conditions, the lot of factory girls remained grim. Besant remarked, "I had seen suffering and death in the East End, but nothing I had seen equalled the misery of these poor girls." Beaten down by unrelenting poverty and the crushing weight of their lot in life, London's destitute turned to what small comforts they could find: cheap gin and opium. In foul-smelling dens and grimy gin palaces, they sought oblivion and temporary escape from cold, hunger, and despair. An observer described one such hovel as dark, low, and stifling, full of a heavy vapour. Men and women were lying on the wretched beds or crouching on the floor. A few lamps on the wall shed a dim light on the scene. Some were picking at their arms or legs with needles. Opium, funnelled into London's rookeries by merchants from Britain's Indian possessions, offered a cheap and ready stupor. Users sprawled insensate on filthy mattresses, sometimes for days, in a twilight netherworld of drug-induced dreams and delirium. Meanwhile, gin shops dispensed turpentine-laced liquor that promised boozy oblivion by the dram to stupefied customers. In 1851, Dickens described these scenes. The gin shops remained open all night long, and the roar of drunkenness never ceased. Miserable women often plied at the doors of the gin shops to feed their starving children. It was these same fog-choked, gas-lit streets and alleys that formed the perfect, lurid backdrop for the most notorious criminal of the Victorian age. In 1888, recurring murders of destitute women in the Whitechapel slums created a fevered atmosphere of dread and morbid fascination. The victims, all prostitutes, had been brutally slashed and mutilated, their viscera strewn about by a seemingly uncatchable killer, soon known as Jack the Ripper. The Ripper's savagery was shocking even to a public jaded by the everyday brutalities of London's underworld. His crimes seemed to spring from some unknowable motive and alien evil beyond comprehension. Wild theories about the murderer's identity abounded. A deranged butcher, a mad doctor, even a member of the royal family. The fact that he was never apprehended only enhanced the growing mythos of a phantom-like monster with satanic cunning, preying on the most helpless dregs of society. Ultimately, the Ripper murders seared themselves into history, not just for their gore and mystery, but for what they revealed about the vulnerability of London's underclass women. It threw into harsh relief how they existed at the very bottom of the city's hierarchy, leading short, brutish lives snuffed out in squalid obscurity until a maniac's blade made them briefly, gruesomely newsworthy. Their fates were a reminder that for those not born to privilege in Victorian London, life was too often nasty, desperate, and short. Even in death, the poor could not escape indignity and exploitation. For those whose families lacked the means for a proper funeral, the grim spectre of the resurrection men, grave robbers who snatched corpses to sell to medical schools for dissection, was a constant fear. The macabre trade stemmed from laws that only permitted executed criminals to be used for anatomical study, creating a ghoulish black market. In 1831, in a shocking scandal known as the Italian Boy case, a gang was found to have murdered a homeless child and sold his corpse for dissection. The resurrection trade flourished in part because death was so ubiquitous in Victorian London. Disease, malnutrition, and squalid living conditions meant mortality visited the lower classes with grim frequency. Tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera, and smallpox ravaged the crowded slums, their spread aided by poor sanitation and hygiene. In 1848-49, a cholera epidemic killed over 14,000 in London, mostly in the impoverished areas south of the Thames. The accepted scientific wisdom of the day attributed the disease to foul odours and miasmas, not yet understanding it was waterborne and spread by contaminated drinking sources. It would take the crisis of the Great Stink in the summer of 1858 to spur real action. That year, London sweltered under a historically hot summer that turned the Thames, by then little more than an open sewer, into a noxious, reeking soup of human and industrial waste. The stench was so overpowering that Parliament, its chambers inundated with the stomach-churning effluvium, draped the windows with curtains soaked in chlorine in a vain attempt to function. The ordeal finally spurred legislators to back a massive civic works project to construct a modern sewer network. The monumental effort was led by the great engineer Joseph Bazalgette, who designed and oversaw the building of over 1,100 miles of underground brick sewers to intercept waste and divert it far downstream. The tunnels were some of the most ambitious municipal engineering feats of the 19th century and a major factor in improving London's sanitation and health in the ensuing decades. Along with the sewers, Bazalgette built the Victoria and Albert embankments, which housed the pipelines and provided riverside promenades still enjoyed today. Bazalgette's sewers were a rare bright spot of progress for London's poor, in an era marked more by piecemeal efforts than systemic change. Social reformers like journalist Henry Mayhew studied the miserable conditions of labourers, street sellers and urchins, but could only incrementally influence the public conscience. Charitable and religious organisations like the Salvation Army and the Quakers operated shelters, soup kitchens and ragged schools for deprived children, but their resources were dwarfed by the immensity of the need. Some limited government reforms aimed at bettering the lot of the underclass, such as the Education Act of 1870, providing funding for new schools, and the Factory Act of 1878, restricting child labour. Private philanthropists, like American banker George Peabody, funded model housing developments to replace some of the most squalid rookeries and tenements with healthier dwellings. But in most cases, such efforts only nibbled at the edges of the city's entrenched poverty and substandard living conditions. Perhaps the most dubious development was the Victorian middle and upper class vogue for slumming. Guided tours of the East End slums and opium dens to peer and gawk at their wretched inhabitants like exhibits in a zoo. Justified as charitable fact-finding missions, they tended to resemble more a form of poverty tourism. The elite rarely ventured into such precincts without a police escort and returned to their comfortable homes, having done little to understand or alleviate the plight of those they regarded with a mixture of pity, disgust and fascination. In the end, for all the small advances and eddies of reform, life for most of London's poor remained a harsh, tenuous proposition throughout the Victorian era and beyond. Despite the city's growing prosperity and global influence, the lot of its underclass altered little. The same crowded, fetid slums, back-breaking and underpaid labour, the ever-present spectres of destitution and the workhouse, all these continue to circumscribe the mean, desperate lives of those at the bottom of Britain's imperial capital. It is hard not to contemplate their plight, to picture them toiling in the shadows of the Strand's grand facades and palatial townhouses, and not feel the injustice and waste of so many drawn, hopeless faces and talents ground to nothing by the great engine of empire. But we can also glimpse in the few who emerged to put a human face on that misery, the reformers and radicals, the match girls and dockers who fought and organised for better lives, the unquenchable spirit that endured in the face of such hardship. The London of today is in many respects unrecognisable from its Victorian ancestor, a city of steel and glass, startling diversity and vibrancy, its grimmiest corners now hipster havens and pricey enclaves. But still, parallels endure. The obscene gulf between affluence and want, the invisible workers who clean and guard the towers of privilege, the same aching social and economic divides that consign too many to hardship. And in this, Victorian London stands eternally as a reminder and rebuke, asking us to remember how we treat the lowest among us, how we look after those ground beneath the wheel, as our great cities rise ever skyward on the labours of ghosts. The poor of London faced a brutal calculus, work grueling, hazardous jobs in abysmal conditions, or risk death by starvation and exposure in the streets. For women, the options were even more agonising. Imagine being Mary Ann Nichols, a 43-year-old mother of 5, cast out by her husband after a string of unlucky breaks. To avoid the workhouse, she takes up lodging in a shabby Whitechapel boarding house. But without respectable work, Mary must turn to the one thing no one can take from her, her body. Night after night, she walks the shadowy streets as a prostitute, living in constant danger. Her bed might be a dank, filthy corner of Whitechapel, or If she's lucky, a 4p a night cubicle at Wilmot's lodging house on Thrall Street. She has little to call her own: a brush and comb, 2 petticoats, a pot of rouge. Every day is a desperate gamble between destitution and perhaps bringing home a shilling to live on. But even this wretched existence is soon cut short. In the early morning mist of August 31st, 1888, Mary's mutilated body is found on the cobblestones of Bucks Row, her throat cut to the bone. The grisly murder sends shockwaves through the East End, and for Mary's fellow prostitutes, it's a chilling warning of a new predator on the prowl: Jack the Ripper. The sad truth was, long before the Ripper's reign of terror, women on the margins led precarious, expendable lives. Earning pennies as labourers or seamstresses was often not enough to survive on. So many were forced to sell their bodies, risking violence and disease. For poor women especially, Victorian London was a bleak and perilous place. They faced a double vulnerability to exploitation at work and brutality at home and in the streets. Wife-beating was shockingly common and even tolerated as a husband's right. Domestic violence drove many women to the streets in the first place. Walking those gaslit alleys at night, soliciting strangers, the threat of abuse was ever present. Rapes and beatings by clients or police were an occupational hazard, to be borne in silence. A sex worker had little legal recourse. She was more likely to be arrested herself for public indecency or disorderly behaviour. Pregnancy was another jeopardy. Contraception was scanty, and many prostitutes bore unwanted children. Backstreet abortions were risky procedures in dingy kitchens or rented rooms. More than a few women bled out or died of infection. Mary Ann Nichols left behind a bleak legacy for her children. Her son Edward followed his mother into a vagabond existence, hawking trinkets on the street. He took up a common-law wife, but she soon died, some say of drink. Edward himself later turned up in the workhouse infirmary, destitute and broken. Mary's daughter Alice fared scarcely better, winding up pregnant and unmarried at 16. She gave birth to her son in the grim confines of the Lambeth workhouse. Though little Victor grew up to be a butcher's boy and soldier, his beginnings were in the shadow of poverty his grandmother knew too well. These snapshots of family pain, captured in workhouse records and census sheets, tell a larger story. For London's poorest women and their offspring, misfortune begat misfortune down the generations. Nichols' tale was sadly typical. A life mired in deprivation, leading to a dangerous trade and ending in a macabre footnote in the annals of crime. Even as the city's wealth and power grew, the options for its underclass of women remained slim and fraught with jeopardy. The same squalid slums that bred killers like the Ripper also bred the desperation of his victims. But amid the oppressive misery, there were flickers of progress and spots of light. Josephine Butler was one crusading voice for London's most marginalised women. An upper-middle-class lady of tireless compassion, she ministered to prostitutes and rape survivors when few others dared. In 1869, Butler helped lead a campaign to repeal the Contagious Diseases Acts, a set of laws that persecuted sex workers in the name of controlling venereal disease. Police could detain any woman suspected of prostitution and force them to undergo degrading pelvic exams. Butler exposed the cruelty of this system, which punished women but overlooked their male clients. Her speeches and writings helped shift Victorian minds to see these women as victims of circumstance, not wanton sinners. While the acts were not fully repealed until 1886, her advocacy laid the groundwork. Other efforts chipped away at the edifice of sexual oppression. Millicent Fawcett, later a leader of the suffragettes, also took up the banner. Just 18 when she heard Butler speak, Fawcett began visiting workhouses and collecting evidence of women's mistreatment to lobby for repeal. This youthful fervour for justice would animate her life's work expanding rights and freedoms for women. Slowly but surely, the plight of London's fallen women seeped into the public consciousness. Novelists and journalists exposed their stark realities. Charles Dickens, in the pages of Oliver Twist, gave an unflinching glimpse into the abuse of the young prostitute Nancy by the violent criminal Bill Sikes. In newspapers and penny dreadfuls, the Ripper murders sparked a feverish fascination, but they also sparked a more sober discussion of the wretched living conditions in the East End that left women so defenceless. Slum clearance schemes and affordable housing became matters of civic interest. The hardscrabble lives of women like Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, and Elizabeth Stride would not be magically transformed, but their ugly, untimely deaths had made the suffering of their sisters harder to ignore. Out of the miasma of violence and vice, a more urgent conversation had begun. Though the Ripper was never unmasked, his grisly spree did tear the veil off another monster stalking London's back alleys, the monster of sexual brutality, born of a culture of exploitation. Confronting it would prove an uphill battle for generations of reformers. But each harrowing headline was a fresh reminder of the human toll of poverty and the unfinished struggle for a more just society. London's lowest women persevered in their daily toil, perched precariously over the abyss, supporting one another in neighbourly networks of shared childcare and pennies loaned, navigating the threats of the streets and the home as best they could without protection of police or politicians. Their survival was a quiet heroism, etched in tired faces in flickering gaslight. As the Victorian era slouched wearily to a close, their struggles were still too often shrouded in shadow. But here and there, shafts of enlightenment had begun to cut through the fog. The movements to educate girls, to win votes for women, to treat prostitutes as people, all had their roots in an era when the suffering of the vulnerable could no longer be ignored. In the tattered shawls and threadbare chemises of women like Mary Ann Nichols, we glimpse the cost of progress, uneven and denied. In their short, fraught, unheralded lives, we trace the slow awakening of a society's conscience. London's overlooked women, and those who lifted them up, lit candles of courage in the gloom, all unsung foremothers in a long march from Victorian cruelty to a more humane future. Jack "Lucky" Jones sat shivering in the pre-dawn gloom, his bare feet dangling over the edge of the quay. The frigid stones sent a deep chill through his thin, ragged trousers. He watched as the last stars faded into the misty twilight. The great clock of Westminster struck 6, its chimes echoing across the sleeping city. Lucky stretched and yawned, his breath pluming in the cold. It was time to begin his daily toil as a mudlark, scavenging the foul banks of the River Thames for bits of coal, wood, and anything else of value that the tides left behind. Mudlarking was hungry, filthy, and often dangerous work, but for thousands of London's poorest children, it was a matter of survival. Lucky's mum had succumbed to cholera when he was 9, her body hauled away and dumped in an unmarked pauper's grave. His da had abandoned them long before that, vanishing into the rookeries of 7 Dials to lose himself in opium and gin. So Lucky was left alone to make his way on the unforgiving streets, relying on his quick wits and quicker feet to stay one step ahead of the workhouses and the bobbies truncheon. As the weak London sun began to break through the sooty haze, Lucky clambered down the embankment and sank ankle-deep into the black muck. The thick miasma of sewage and decay filled his nostrils, but he was well accustomed to the stench. He scanned the lumpy moonscape of silt, his keen eyes seeking any glints of metal or promising shapes. Mudlarks like Lucky dreamed of finding treasures in the Thames muck, coins, silver spoons, or brass buttons that could be sold for a few bob. But those prizes were few and far between. Mostly it was bits of coal, wood, and nails. Paltry pickings barely worth the effort. The only reliable income came from the junk shops who paid pennies for old rags and bones used to make paper and fertilizer. Suddenly, a glint caught Lucky's eye. A flash of dull metal protruding from the mud a few feet out. His heart raced with cautious hope as he slogged toward it, his numbed feet slipping on the treacherous footing. Reaching down, he plunged his arm into the frigid ooze and pulled. The sucking mud released its prize, and Lucky fell back hard, something heavy and hard in his grip. He wiped off the dripping black slime, revealing a tarnished silver pocket watch in his palm. Lucky marveled at the elaborate scrollwork etched on the dented case. It was certainly not in working condition, waterlogged and fouled with mud as it was, but the silver content alone might fetch a whole 2 shillings from a kindly fence. Lucky muttered a quiet prayer of thanks for the river's bounty. It would be a rare good day. But as Lucky gazed out across the swift, dark current of the Thames, he found his elation tempered by melancholy. How many more years could he survive by picking the river's bones? Already, he was as tall as many grown men, and could no longer crawl through the smaller sewer grates as a tosher. Soon, he would have to find a man's wages to fill his hungry belly. The dockyards, the factories, or the coal pits, with their promise of broken backs and black lung. There were few paths for lads like Lucky, and all of them led to pain. The watcher's dull gleam caught the rising sun as Lucky turned it over in his raw, cracked hands. Who would it belong to, he wondered? Some bourgeois swell, flush with the wealth of the empire, heedless to the suffering at his feet. Or perhaps some poor bloke like his own Dar, who drowned his despair in drink and left his burdens behind. It was impossible to say, but for now at least, the timepiece would buy Lucky another day's survival in the unforgiving city. With an effort, Lucky shook off his dark musings and pocketed his prize. There were hours yet till the tides rose and he had much ground to cover. He slogged off through the mire, just another small, lone figure dwarfed by the smokestacks and spires of the world's richest city, where misery and fortune lived hand in hand. The Thames flowed on as it had for centuries, a silent witness to the joys and agonies of the great metropolis that grew upon its banks. Life in the workhouses was its own kind of mudlarking, where the destitute poor traded their dignity and freedom for a sparse subsistence. To step across the threshold of those grim brick bastilles was to abandon all hope, severing the ties of family and the comforts of choice. But for those with nowhere else to turn, the workhouse was the final safety net between life and death, a sanctuary as pitiless as the streets. Annie Chapman knew the workhouse well. Born in the London slum of Paddington, her youth was a blur of brothels, prisons, and poorhouses as she struggled to scrape by. The threat of the workhouse loomed over her like the sword of Damocles, a constant spur to clutch at any chance for a roof and a meal, no matter how degrading. Time and again, desperation drove Annie to trade her body in the streets or spend sleepless nights in doss houses, huddled in verminous straw, listening to the groans and cries of her fellow unfortunates. For a brief time, it seemed Annie might escape her dismal fate. She married a soldier, John Chapman, and bore him 2 daughters. But any domestic tranquility was shattered when John died in 1886, leaving Annie alone to scrape by selling matches and crocheting. When times grew lean and rent came due, Annie would take to the streets, standing under gaslights in the Spitalfields nights, selling her favours to strangers. It was a tenuous existence, stalked by hunger and violence, but it was better than the workhouse. Annie fought like a wildcat to avoid the union's cold embrace. But as she grew older and the gin flowed quicker, the workhouse finally claimed her. She was forced to send her daughters away to a charity school and submit herself to the Lambeth workhouse. There she donned the rough prison-like garb, scratchy as sackcloth against her skin, a pauper's uniform of shame. Her haggard face and despairing eyes peered out from under a coarse bonnet, as hopeless as any inmates. The workhouse master glowered down from his pulpit at this new grist for his mill. He ordered the filthy assemblage to fall to their knees and praise the Christian charity that spared them from starvation, though their aching bellies spoke otherwise. His droning sermon washed over Annie's bowed head unheeded. Her thoughts were consumed with memories of warm embraces and childish laughter, the ghosts of a family now scattered to the winds. The master instructed them to rise, but for Annie, all that greeted her was the grinding toil and regimented horror ahead. Each day was an exercise in exhausted misery. The inmates rose before dawn to a rude clanging bell and shuffled into the dining hall for a breakfast of tasteless gruel and hard tack. Their heads hung in grey resignation. From there, it was on to the day's grim labours, chopping bones, breaking rocks, picking oakum until fingers bled and eyes strained in the weak light. All this for the privilege of a straw mattress, a thin blanket, and a penny a day in the unlikely event of release. For Annie, the workhouse was a special kind of purgatory. The respectable wives shunned the unfortunates like her who bore the invisible scars of the street. The men leered with hungry eyes, sidling up to whisper vile propositions. Brawls and fits were common among the ill and desperate, punctuated by screams for mercy that went unheard. Through it all, the wardens and matrons seemed to delight in devising new humiliations, confiscating small treasures as contraband, or ordering intimate inspections for signs of disease. One frigid winter's night, Annie finally fled into the chill darkness, unable to bear another moment locked in with London's human refuse. She huddled in a Spitalfields doorway, her breath pluming before her pinched face. The workhouse gruel sat like a stone in her shrunken belly. She knew that come daybreak, she would have to return or else perish of hunger and exposure. But for a few blessed hours, Annie was free, alone with her grief and memories under cold, distant stars. Years later, Annie Chapman would achieve a grim celebrity as the second victim of London's most notorious killer, Jack the Ripper. Her mutilated body would be displayed in all its lurid detail on the front pages of the penny dreadfuls, devoured by a fascinated public. But as she lay in that Hanbury Street yard, her life's blood slowly ebbing into the cracks between the cobbles, it's doubtful Annie spared much thought for her soon-to-be murderer. Her final breaths were surely filled with visions of warm, childish smiles and happier days long since consigned to the gutters and workhouses of cruel, uncaring London. The terrifying crimes of Jack the Ripper. In the autumn of 1888, a sinister shadow fell over the narrow, cobblestoned alleys of London's East End. As the fog curled through the night, a figure lurked in the gaslit darkness. A mysterious killer who would become known as Jack the Ripper. Between August and November of that year, 5 women were brutally murdered, their bodies left mutilated in the dim streets of Whitechapel and Spitalfields. All were prostitutes, struggling to survive in the harshest corners of Victorian society. The first victim was Mary Ann Nichols, discovered in the early hours of August 31st. Her body, stabbed and slashed with a savagery that shocked even hardened police officers, was found in a gutter on Bucks Row. Over the next 3 months, 4 more women would meet the same horrific fate: Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. As news of each grisly murder spread, panic gripped the streets of the East End. The police, armed with little more than whistles and lanterns, struggled to find the killer who seemed to melt into the shadows. Hampered by the dark, twisting alleyways and the tight-lipped distrust of the poor residents, the investigation stalled and sputtered. The neighbourhood already had an eerie, gothic atmosphere, but the fog-draped crime scenes and the Ripper's dark deeds only deepened the sense of dread. Gossip and rumour spread like a fever as the public became transfixed by the mysterious murderer. Hundreds of letters, allegedly from the killer, poured into police stations and newspapers. Some even signed Jack the Ripper, and thus a legend was born. Morbid souvenir hunters snatched up gruesome mementos, while droves of amateur sleuths tried to unravel the case. The press, sensing a story that sold papers, churned out sensational reports detailing the mutilations and speculating about the Ripper's identity. Was he a doctor, driven mad by dark obsessions? A butcher with the skills to deftly wield a knife? Or perhaps a gentleman by day who stalked and killed by night? Desperate for a breakthrough, the police even arrested Queen Victoria's grandson, Prince Albert Victor, though he was later cleared. From a sinister barber to Lewis Carroll, author of Alice in Wonderland, the list of potential suspects seemed to grow longer each day. But despite the feverish speculation, Jack the Ripper's true identity remained as elusive as his blood-stained blade. Vigilante mobs roamed the alleys and nearly killed several innocent men, while the actual murderer continued to escape justice. The Ripper's seeming ability to evade capture lent an almost supernatural air to the crimes, as if he were a phantom who could vanish into the swirling London mists. In time, the murders suddenly stopped, but not the questions surrounding the killer who was never unmasked. The mystery of Jack the Ripper endures to this day, fueling countless books, films, and macabre tours tracing his bloody path through London. His grim legacy became an emblem of the Victorian era's dark underbelly, a reminder of the perils stalking those cobblestone streets each night. But while the Ripper may be the most infamous, he was far from the only menace in the shadows. Violent crime and vice were woven into the fabric of the 19th century slums, born out of the desperation of crippling poverty. Gangs like the Whitechapel 40 Elephants prowled the back alleys, perfecting the arts of pickpocketing and housebreaking. Gambling dens and brothels promised escape and pleasure, but often lead to ruin and despair. For many, death was a constant companion, whether it came from a burglar's blade or the ravages of hunger and disease. As the gas lamps flickered and the hansom cabs rattled by, the poor and forgotten of London's East End looked over their shoulders and hurried past the spots where the Ripper's victims had lain. The autumn of terror had carved deep scars, and the cobblestones seemed to whisper of the horrors they had seen. Jack the Ripper was never caught, but his crimes had captured something true about the heartbeat of the city, that beneath the fog and finery, in the shadows of progress, the spectre of violence was always lurking. The Victorian cult of death. For the Victorians, the veil between life and death was thin, and the trappings of grief were woven into the very fabric of society. In an era plagued by poverty, disease, and accidents, death was an ever-present spectre looming over both rich and poor. The average life expectancy in Victorian England hovered around 40 years old, and child mortality rates were staggeringly high. In the cramped and filthy slums, entire families could be wiped out by a single outbreak of cholera or typhoid fever. Faced with such brutal realities, the Victorians developed elaborate rituals and strictures around death and mourning. Funerals were somber, lavish affairs, with no detail overlooked in the all-consuming business of grief. Undertakers offered a dizzying array of caskets and urns, while newspapers hawked black-bordered mourning stationery and special funeral biscuits. There was even a whole industry devoted to post-mortem photography, capturing eerie images of the deceased posed as if still alive. For the wealthy, the etiquette of mourning was every bit as rigid as the social hierarchies of life. When Prince Albert, the beloved husband of Queen Victoria, died of typhoid in 1861, the Queen threw herself into deepest mourning, wrapping herself in a widow's weeds that she would wear for the next 40 years until her own death. As the trendsetter for her class, Victoria's prolonged bereavement rippled across high society. Elaborate mourning dresses allowed wealthy women to telegraph the depths of their grief, with special fabrics and veils dictated for each phase of mourning. But for the poor, Even the basic dignity of a proper funeral and burial could be out of reach. Many families could not afford the cost of a coffin, let alone the fees for a plot in the overcrowded city churchyards. The truly destitute faced the grim prospect of anatomists claiming their loved ones' corpses for medical dissection, a fate considered a deep violation of the dead. This led to the rise of so-called resurrection men, shadowy figures who stole freshly interred bodies from graveyards to sell to doctors for a tidy profit. Even in the darkest of times, the Victorians found ways to celebrate and commemorate the dead. Lavish monuments and tombstones filled the grand garden cemeteries on the outskirts of London, where the upper classes interred their departed in a lush, park-like setting. Mourning jewellery woven with the hair of the deceased allowed people to keep a tangible part of their loved ones close. Public mourning for figures like Admiral Nelson and the Duke of Wellington verged on mass hysteria, with grandiose state funerals and monuments erected in their honour. The spectre of death may have stalked the streets of Victorian London, but it also spurred acts of remembrance, from humble keepsakes to the soaring spires and weeping angels still watching over its fabled graveyards. In death, it seemed, even the poorest and most powerless could finally achieve a measure of dignity and a shot at immortality. The Great Leveller, the Grim Reaper, bound the citizens of the city together more than any other force. As much as railways and ships knitted together the empire, it was this collective dance with death and loss that made Victorian London a singular metropolis of grief and memory. Slumming it, the Victorian fascination with poverty. Even as they averted their eyes from the suffering on their doorsteps, the Victorian upper classes found themselves drawn to the dark allure of London's slums. In the fashionable drawing rooms of Mayfair and Belgravia, a peculiar trend emerged: slumming, or venturing into the poorest neighbourhoods to observe how the other half lived. For the elite, the East End became a sort of human zoo, where they could safely gawk at the exotic wildlife of the underclass from the comfort of their carriages. Guided tours sprang up to cater to these high society thrill seekers, led by police constables or self-proclaimed experts on the urban underbelly. For a fee, gentlemen and ladies could be whisked through the narrow streets of Whitechapel or the crowded rookeries of St. Giles, taking in the sights, sounds and smells of abject poverty. They marvelled at the colourful street markets and the exotic wares of the Jewish quarter, while holding their noses at the stench of the open sewers and the unwashed poor. Some slummers claimed a noble motive, a desire to understand and help the less fortunate. Writers and journalists like Henry Mayhew and Jack London disguised themselves to spend time among the poor, documenting their daily struggles in vivid, unsparing detail. Their accounts, like Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor, became sensational bestsellers, sparking a wave of social consciousness and calls for reform. But for many, slumming was a more voyeuristic pastime, a way to indulge in the vicarious thrills of rubbing shoulders with the dangerous classes. They sought out the opium dens and penny gaffs, sampling the exotic vices of the Orient and the cheap amusements of the masses. There was a dark romanticism to the idea of the noble savage, the penniless but happy-go-lucky cockney taking life as it came. It allowed the rich to feel worldly and adventurous, without leaving the gilded cage of their own privilege. Even the great Charles Dickens was not immune to the slumming craze. As a young journalist, he spent hours wandering the winding alleys of the slums, soaking up the colour and pathos he would pour into novels like Oliver Twist and Bleak House. His unflinching depictions of workhouses and debtors' prisons pricked the conscience of the nation, even as his more sentimental portraits of happy urchins and plucky pickpockets captured the public imagination. In the end, the vogue for slumming was a double-edged sword. It did raise awareness of the plight of the poor and spur some much-needed reforms, from the expansion of the sewer system to the construction of new schools and hospitals. But it also had an undercurrent of condescension and exploitation, a sense that poverty was a form of entertainment for the bored and jaded upper crust. The poor were not consulted on whether they wanted to be gawked at like animals in a menagerie. Still, the fascination with the slums left an indelible mark on Victorian culture, from the social realist novels of Dickens and Gaskell to the haunting photographs of street life captured by John Thompson. It revealed a hunger to pull back the veil on the unmentionable underside of empire, to confront the festering wounds beneath the pomp and splendour. The slums may have been a world apart from the glittering West End, but they were still part of the living, breathing organism that was London, a city of 1,000,000 stories, each more heartbreaking and captivating than the last. The Great Stink and the birth of modern sanitation. By the summer of 1858, London was ripe for disaster. The city had grown explosively over the previous decades, its population swelling to over 2 million souls, crammed into a labyrinth of narrow streets and crowded tenements. But the Victorian capital's infrastructure had not kept pace with this relentless growth. The ancient sewers and cesspools, many dating back to medieval times, were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of human waste and industrial effluent pouring into them each day. As the temperatures soared that June, the city began to bake in the heat, and a miasma of noxious odours rose from the depths. The stench was so overpowering that it became known as the Great Stink, a crisis that would finally spur London to action on sanitation. The Thames, once a shimmering ribbon of life, had become an open sewer, its waters thick with the fecal matter and rotting rubbish of the metropolis. The stink was so bad that it invaded the halls of Parliament itself, causing the great and the good to gag and flee the building in search of fresher air. For years, reformers like Edwin Chadwick and John Snow had been warning of the dire consequences of London's primitive waste disposal system. They had linked the city's recurring cholera epidemics to the contaminated water supply, but their pleas for change had fallen on deaf ears. It took the Great Stink, with its assault on the delicate sensibilities of the ruling classes, to finally break through the inertia and galvanise the government into action. Parliament hastily passed a bill to fund a massive overhaul of London's sewers, appointing the visionary engineer Joseph Basil Gett to oversee the project. Basil Gett's plan was breathtakingly ambitious. A vast network of underground brick tunnels that would intercept the waste from the old sewers and ferry it miles downstream, away from the heart of the city. The scale of the undertaking was staggering, requiring over 1,000 miles of new pipelines and the excavation of 2.5 million cubic meters of earth. The construction of the new sewers was a Herculean feat of engineering and perseverance. Armies of navvies, the hard-bitten labourers who had built the railways, toiled in appalling conditions to carve out the tunnels by hand. They braved cave-ins, explosions, and the constant threat of disease as they inched their way through the bowels of the city. Many paid with their lives, succumbing to the noxious gases and airborne pathogens that lurked in the fetid depths. But slowly, inexorably, Basil Gett's vision took shape. The great interceptor sewers, marvels of brick and mortar, began to snake their way beneath the streets, gathering the waste and channeling it far out into the Thames estuary. Above ground, the city's landscape was transformed by the construction of the Victoria and Chelsea embankments, broad new thoroughfares that reclaimed land from the river and provided a stately facade for the pumping stations and outfall sewers. When the new system finally came online in the late 1860s, the effect was dramatic. The Great Stink abated, and the Thames began to run clear again for the first time in generations. The cholera epidemics that had once claimed tens of thousands of lives were brought to heel as clean water and efficient waste disposal became the norm rather than the exception. London, it seemed, had finally entered the modern age, its streets and rivers no longer clogged with the detritus of human misery. Of course, the battle against filth and disease was far from over. The slums of the East End would remain a breeding ground for poverty and squalor for decades to come, and the scars of the city's haphazard growth could not be erased overnight. But the Great Stink and the birth of London's modern sewer system marked a turning point, a moment when the Victorian city began to reckon with its own dark underbelly and take steps to create a more livable, humane environment for all its citizens. Today, Basilgate's sewers still form the backbone of London's wastewater infrastructure, a testament to the skill and foresight of their creator. They stand as a reminder of the hard-won progress that brought light and air to the darkest corners of the city, and of the unsung heroes who toiled beneath the streets to make it all possible. The Great Stink may have been a bleak chapter in London's history, but it also marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the health and welfare of the masses would no longer be sacrificed on the altar of progress and prosperity. Philanthropy and social reform. Amidst the grime and despair of Victorian London, there were glimmers of hope and compassion. Even as the city's poor suffered in abject misery, a new spirit of philanthropy and social reform was beginning to take hold among the more enlightened members of the upper and middle classes. Gradually, the idea took root that poverty was not simply a fact of life, but a social ill that could and must be alleviated through charity and legislative action. One of the early pioneers of this movement was the journalist Henry Mayhew, whose groundbreaking book, London Labour and the London Poor, shed light on the harsh realities of working-class life in the 1840s. Mayhew spent years immersed in the slums and rookeries of the East End, interviewing everyone from street hawkers to sewer scavengers about their daily struggles. His vivid, unsparing accounts of squalor and deprivation shocked the conscience of the nation and inspired a new generation of social reformers. Another key figure in this burgeoning crusade against poverty was the Salvation Army, founded by William and Catherine Booth in 1865. Originally a Christian mission dedicated to saving souls in the slums, the Salvation Army quickly evolved into a major provider of social services for the poor. Under the banner of soup, soap, and salvation, the Booths and their army of volunteers operated shelters, soup kitchens, and workhouses across London, providing a lifeline for the destitute and dispossessed. As the 19th century wore on, the idea of social reform began to gain traction in the halls of power as well. The Education Act of 1870 was a major milestone, providing government funding for the construction of new schools and making education compulsory for all children up.